acclaim. Puss in Boots Retold. A tale from the romance, a medieval fairy tale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. 1. Most girls dreamed of marriage, children, and being mistress of their own homes, however humble or grand those homes might be. Caterina had been mistress of Burg Rumpelstiltskin since the day she was born within the castle's massive walls. Only now, she woke screaming from nightmares that she would not have the fortitude to keep the castle she called home. It didn't help that her father's illness was about to win the battle for his life. "Promise me you will continue to keep the castle when I am gone. Promise me, Caterina. As long as the steward bloodline lives between these walls, the castle will stand for 1,000 years and never fall. Promise me you will not let the burg fall." Her father wheezed in his waking moments, making her promise more times than she could count. What else could she say to a dying man except, "Yes, father, I promise"? His failing eyesight could not perceive how the walls crumbled, or how the roof leaked when it rained. Or that they no longer had enough men to raise the drawbridge, and even if they did, there was no guarantee the rusted chains would hold. Her only consolation was that the floods from 3 years ago had loosened the bridge supports, so if an army did try to invade the castle, the bridge would likely collapse beneath them, drowning them in the swift, swirling current of the river as it licked at the castle walls on its way to the Moselle down in the valley. Even after her father was buried in the churchyard, beneath a stone marked with only a cross and his name, Barnabas Steward, she still fancied she could hear his voice on the wind. As she accepted the tithe from the farmers, who prospered on the lands surrounding the burg, or flew the falcons from the mews to catch fresh meat for the table, or tallied up the stores in the extensive cellars beneath the castle, or commanded the castle's few remaining staff to do what was necessary to keep the crumbling castle alive, or as she prayed the stones would not fall and bury them all in their sleep, she remembered her promise, and hoped it would be enough. But if the king found out about her father's death, no amount of good stewardship would save her, for the king would appoint another man in his place, and Caterina would lose everything. So she toiled on, secure in the knowledge that the king had never visited Burg Rumpelstiltskin in more than 20 years, and as long as they sent the proper tithe to the crown, he'd never felt the need to send even a representative to check on the place either. Until a missive arrived, bearing the royal seal, the golden wax enough to ruin even the most perfect summer day. 2. Don't you want to see the royal court? Kempenich asked. In my day, the emperor's court was the grandest place any of us had ever seen. I only wish I could have seen Burg Rumpelstiltskin appear even half as grand. Tessa sighed. I'm sure in your time Charles the Great was actually great, but over the centuries, his descendants have become far more self-serving. I've seen the court many times, and if I were to stand before the king and queen who rule that court, I would not be able to keep my mouth shut, and my words, however true, would cost Isaac and I everything. So we will stay here in this nice little inn, while Isaac tells them the daughter they traded away so that they might rule over that court is dead, and they grant him his ancestral lands, as they promised. Once they grant him his rightful lands and titles, then we can leave with him, and no one will be the wiser. I look forward to seeing Burg Rumpelstiltskin. It was only a timber great house when I last saw it. To think it is now a stone castle. Movement caught his eye, and Kempenich pounced. The rat struggled beneath his paw, so he bit into its neck, and it stilled. Would you like the first one for your dinner, my lady? I can catch another. There are plenty within the walls. Tessa eyed the dying rat. Thank you, Sir Kempenich, but the innkeeper is supposed to bring up my dinner from the kitchen within the hour. The rats are all yours, and the sooner we leave this infested city, the better. Kempenich finished up the choicest parts of the rat, then left the rest and began to clean his whiskers. You should buy a new dress for your wedding, or at least the cloth to make one. You will want a grand gown for all the people to see when you marry their baron. With Isaac so close to the king and queen, you might be lucky enough to marry in the cathedral, before the whole court." Tessa shook her head. "My parents might have sold me so that they could rule the court, but if they learn I still live, they'll marry me off for some misguided alliance before we can blink. No, we shall sneak out of the city without them seeing me, and when the time is right, we shall marry in the chapel at Burg Rumpelstiltskin. I shall have time to weave the cloth for my gown and sew it myself. But you could find a bride willing to wed you in the cathedral, I'm sure. How many she-cats are lucky enough to win the heart of one of Charlemagne's knights?" Kempenich spluttered. "You would have me rut with an animal? If you were a man, I would call you out to answer for such an insult to my honor." "Well, I don't know if you've noticed, Sir Kempenich, but you do have fur, 4 legs and a tail, which makes you as much an animal as any other cat in these lands." She shrugged. "I don't think any human woman will have you, which is a pity, because Isaac and I won't be able to have children, so you're pretty much his only chance of carrying on the family line. Though I don't imagine the king will make a cat a baron, but if he doesn't know." "You cannot hide such a thing from a king, and to even attempt to do so would be treason," the cat declared. "I'm sure you or I would do as good a job as any of his existing barons, if not better." "A prosperous, well-run country is hardly treason," Tessa said. "You are a woman, and a young one at that. You could never understand," Kempenich sniffed. As if to prove his point, the girl just laughed. "Yes, I will never understand why men can be such fools. Ah, I spy Isaac returning. Perhaps he will join us for dinner after all." The boy's boots thumped up the stairs, before he threw the door open. "It is done. I am now the rightful Baron von Rumpelstiltskin, master of the Burg and all its lands. The king offered to hold a feast in my honor, but now the queen is in mourning over her lost daughter. It will be some months before such a celebration could occur. With his blessing, we shall go the Burg and be home before harvest." This heartened Kempenich, though he found it hard to believe there would be much of a harvest in the forest around the house he remembered. Most of the income from his lands had come from offering hospitality to travelers, and taxing the trade route that passed through his lands. Perhaps that was what Isaac meant, they'd be home before the traders arrived, transporting their harvest for sale. They'd all wanted to pat his bronze lion for luck when they left. Kempenich wondered if the statue still guarded the bridge. If it did not, he would see to it that Isaac had another one made, for it would not be the house of Rumpelstiltskin without a golden lion to greet guests. After all, it had been quite some time since Kempenich had made his deal with the witch, to improve his family's fortunes. The house had grown into a castle, so surely the family's wealth had grown to be able to afford one statue. Perhaps they had a dozen now, a whole pride of lions prowling on both sides of the bridge. Kempenich couldn't help but smile at the image in his mind's eye, as he curled up on the bed for his 10th cat nap of the day. 3. The clatter of hooves on the bridge was enough warning to bring Caterina to the castle bailey, in time to greet the uninvited arrival. For 3 years she dreaded this moment, but now it had arrived, she didn't dare show fear in the face of the royal messenger, for mounted on such a fine horse and wearing that striking livery, he could be no one else. "Greetings, traveler. You bear a message from the king?" she asked, determined to show the man that she was mistress of this castle and no one else. Even if the man was about to tell her the king had found out about her father's passing, and intended to send his replacement, turning her out of her home and the castle, she'd run as capably as any man, both before and after her father's death. The man scanned the courtyard. "I have orders to give the king's missive to the steward at Burg Rumpelstiltskin, and no one else." Caterina squared her shoulders. "I am his daughter, and chatelaine of this castle. I will take it to him." She held out her hand for the scroll. He only hesitated for a moment, before he handed it over. Then he turned his horse around and headed out the gate, as quickly as he'd come. as if he believed the stories about the castle being cursed. Caterina snorted. People were so gullible. She'd lived here all her life, and she'd never seen hide nor hair of any curse. Yet travelers would travel several miles out of their way to the next village, rather than sleep under the cursed castle's roof. It wasn't a curse that had caused the last baron to turn traitor, and then disappear. Nor had it been a curse that had taken his wife in childbirth, leaving their infant son to be fostered at court, where he'd likely remain, for Burg Rumpelstiltskin was no place for a silk-cocooned courtier. Or even the king's messenger. True to her word, Caterina carried the king's missive through the castle, up to the churchyard behind the chapel. She broke the king's wax seal and unrolled the piece of parchment. Cornflowers now grew over her father's grave in memory of Caterina's late mother, and as the late blooms nodded in the wind, she fancied they nodded just as her father used to do, when she'd read his correspondence aloud. Sir Isaac von Rumpelstiltskin has reached his age of majority, and as he has pledged proper loyalty to the crown, we have seen fit to grant him his father's castellan lands, Burg Rumpelstiltskin, effective immediately. See that the castle is made ready for the new Baron of Rumpelstiltskin, for he rides to inspect and take possession of his new lands. By the grace of His Majesty, King Lubos. The bands constricting Caterina's chest eased. The king was not replacing her father at all, instead he was sending some pampered courtier to inspect his prize. A man who'd probably never left the capital, who knew nothing of running a vast estate, or even a castle as large as this. A man who did not belong here. "I know what to do, father," she said to the stone that bore his name. "I will show this baron that I am the best chatelaine his castle could possibly have, and that he is not needed here. The sooner he returns to court, the better, before the imaginary curse can affect him." An ominous creak sounded behind her. She eyed the church roof, which had already collapsed during a particularly heavy snowfall last winter. "Perhaps I shall ask him to send some builders and gold for repairs, when he returns to court." Yes. That would be a good plan. One that would give her leave to stay here at the Burg indefinitely, without interference from any man who mistakenly thought they knew better than her. 4. Tessa and Isaac slept too much, Kempenich decided. While he did not mind sharing the warmth of their bedroll at night, he had no desire to continue sharing it once the sun had risen and all the lovely snacks were scampering about. He'd hunted deer and wild boar with his father in the distant past, but that was nothing compared to the thrill of catching prey with one's own claws, biting down and tasting lifeblood as the creature's struggles slowed, for even the smallest squirrel knew when to surrender to fate. He remembered this road being more wooded, without so many fields or so many people. It must be harvest time or something, for so many people to be out in the fields. Perhaps he should go and ask them. Isaac would appreciate knowing more about the lands they passed through when he was done rutting with Tessa, which Kempenich knew the couple insisted on doing every morning before breakfast. Kempenich pulled on his boots, then fastened his belt around his middle, making sure his dagger was still in its sheath. It was a far cry from the sword he was accustomed to carrying, but Isaac had insisted a larger weapon would be more of a burden than a benefit, given his current size. Kempenich had reluctantly agreed, particularly as his paws were not as dexterous as his hands had been. The dagger was also short enough not to drag on the ground when he trotted off on all fours either, in want of greater speed. Though he drew himself up to his full height when he reached the peasants harvesting whatever was growing in the field. "You there! Whose lands are these?" Kempenich called, his hand on the hilt of his. Well, it was the closest thing he had to a sword, so he would call it that. Woe to anyone who forced him to draw his blade. The peasants merely stared, gaping mouths, not saying a word. "Tell me whose lands these are, or I shall slice you up into mincemeat," he roared, brandishing his claws. "We serve Burg Rumpelstiltskin and the king," one man stammered, before another man cuffed him. Don't speak to the devil, or he will ruin the harvest, and we will not have enough to pay the tithe. Chase him away. The devil's cat has no place here." The men raised their tools, scythes and forks, and Kempenich couldn't say what else, and rushed at him in what was an impressive charge for peasants. Kempenich considered teaching them the folly of attacking one of Karl the Great's knights, but only for a moment. These were Isaac's men, and punishing them was up to him. He would return to camp and tell Isaac instead. So he dropped to all fours and soon outdistanced the superstitious peasants. The devil's cat, indeed. When Isaac told them his true identity, they would apologize for the insult. If they were noblemen equal in station to himself, he might have drawn his blade, but mere peasants. They were beneath his attention. Yes, he would let Isaac deal with them. Ugh, were those two rutting again? They were worse than rabbits. Then again, rabbits were rather tasty, and he had seen a burrow this morning while he'd been snacking on squirrels. Kempenich turned his back on the couple, to see if he could find a suitable burrow where he might catch more breakfast. 5. Caterina took her spinning up to the Baroness's bower, the chamber at the top of the highest tower, as she had every day since receiving the king's letter. She much preferred to work in the still room above the kitchens, where the heat from the ever-present cook fires kept it warm and dry even in the depths of winter, but the tower had the best view, and she meant to have plenty of warning before the Baron's arrival. She had expected to wait weeks for the Baron to come, and for him to ride in at the head of a company of men, for no courtier could be expected to ride around the countryside without guards to protect him from wolves, and whatever else lurked in the woods. So when two riders appeared on the road, looking dusty and travel-worn, she almost ignored them. They were undoubtedly coming to Burg Rumpelstiltskin, but they looked more lost than anything. One of the servants would take their names and tell her when they arrived, Caterina told herself, dipping her fingers into the bowl of water, before returning to her flax fibers. Instinct made her look again. Whether it was the glint of sunlight on something one of the riders was wearing that had caught her eye, or some sort of second sight like the which her father had believed even in his final moments, Caterina did not know, but it had her peering out the window at the pair. It wasn't the riders who had caught the light, but the horses. Their tack was studded with silver or at least highly polished steel, and they looked like they'd come from the king's own stable. Not the pony his courier had ridden either. Caterina dried her hands, and opened the chest beneath the window. Her own wardrobe was serviceable at best, but meeting with a courtier required something far finer than she owned. Fortunately, the previous baronesses had owned chests of silk and linen gowns that she and previous chatelaines had carefully preserved, including a couple that appeared to be cloth of gold or embroidered in gold thread. She'd already taken inventory of everything in this room, and aired the gown that suited her best. No gold for her. Those were heavy, not to mention far more ostentatious than anything she'd ever dared to wear, but there was one in bronze silk, exactly the same shade as her hair, or so it seemed in the unusually large mirror fixed to the wall in here. She stripped down to nothing, donning some long-gone baroness's snowy linen chemise and underdress, with a pair of silk stockings, before lacing up the bronze gown in front of the mirror. She hadn't bothered with a cap or veil for her hair this morning, and it would take too much time to brush and braid it properly before pinning it up, so she bundled it into a bun and tied it with a sash that probably should have gone around the waist of her gown. Unless it was supposed to be woven into the baroness's braid instead. Hooves clattered on the bridge, telling her she was out of time. Caterina dashed down the stairs, determined to make a good impression. Her home and her future rested on the new baron's whim, and she would not let her father down. 6. Kempenich lifted his head out of Tessa's saddlebag, where he'd been sleeping. Perhaps he should not have eaten quite so many rabbits this morning. Or it might have been the squirrels that made him so sleepy. or the rocking movement of the horse as it ate up the miles between the capital and home. Whatever had sent him to sleep, he was wide awake now, with towers that actually towered above the forest ahead. Burg Rumpelstiltskin was bigger than he'd believed possible. From the house on stilts that had given him his family name, to this edifice that rose up from the river, walled on all sides, his family's fortunes had indeed changed, just as he'd imagined. Why, this was bigger than the king's castle in the capital. Kempenich began to purr. Then Tessa's horse stopped short, so as not to collide with Isaac, who blocked the road onto the bridge. "The bridge is broken," Isaac murmured, frowning. It looked fine to Kempenich. Solid stone instead of the timber he remembered. "Wait for me a moment. I shall see if it will hold us before we cross," Isaac said, dismounting. He stripped down to his tunic and hose, before sliding down to the narrow band of sand at the river's edge. Then he vanished under the bridge, so all Kempenich could see were swirling waters. "Isaac! That's dangerous. Come back!" Kempenich called, dread curling a claw around his heart. His descendant could not die today. "He'll be fine. See? He's already on the other side of the bridge, climbing up the bank," Tessa said, pointing. Kempenich did not understand how the woman could be so calm. Weren't women supposed to be the hysterical ones? If he was worried, she certainly should be. Unless she did not love Isaac as ardently as the boy adored her. Isaac appeared beside his horse, pausing only to wrap his dripping body in his cloak, before he said, "The supports upriver are damaged, but the downriver ones seem secure. So if we keep to that side of the bridge, no one else should get wet today. I'll see about fixing things in the morning." He led the way over the bridge, walking beside his horse instead of riding, and Tessa followed. The river is certainly swift enough to support a water wheel, perhaps even two. I'll see if Romain is willing to design something suitable. That roof looks like it needs to be replaced, and that wall needs work, or it will crumble into the river when the water rises next spring. Is that tower crooked, or is it just me? Isaac took inventory of every detail as he approached, details Kempenich would not have noticed. Were his family's fortunes failing? They'd been able to afford to build this huge castle, but if it was now falling down for lack of funds or care, Kempenich needed to fix things. Perhaps that was why he'd been awakened in this time, though he had no idea why he'd been given a cat's body instead of his own huge frame. Right now, he could probably fit his whole body inside his helm, if his armor had not been allowed to go to rack and ruin, the way this castle had. "Can it be fixed?" Kempenich asked. Isaac reached over and patted him with a damp hand. "Fear not, fierce feline. Everything can be repaired or replaced. All it takes is materials and time. Time in which you wish for me to be silent, like I was merely an animal," Kempenich snapped. "All because you have insolent peasants. I merely said it might be safer for you to pretend to be an ordinary cat, and refrain from speaking or walking on your hind legs, where people who don't know you might be alarmed by it. I'm sure if you met a cat that walked and talked like a man before becoming one yourself, you would suspect sorcery or some other powers at work," Isaac said. He'd seen himself, and he knew sorcery was responsible. He just did not know how. But he had bigger problems right now. His family's castle was falling down, and the last scion of his illustrious line had dared to touch him with wet hands. Kempenich shot Isaac a look of deep disgust, and began to lick the water droplets off his fur. "Greetings and well met, travelers. What is your business here at Burg Rumpelstiltskin?" The woman had a low, melodious voice that was pleasing even to a cat's ear, but the sight of her even made Kempenich's jaw drop. Caught in a ray of summer sunlight, her gown seemed to glow gold, along with her hair. Silk, if Kempenich was not mistaken. For a moment, he thought he was looking at his own wife, Aenir, but it could not be. She was younger than Aenir, and he'd never been able to afford so much silk during his life. One of Aeneas's descendants then, as Isaac was his. Isaac stepped forward, still dripping. "I'm Baron Isaac von Rumpelstiltskin, and I've finally come home." He gazed up in delight at the crumbling castle he'd complained about only moments ago, as if he'd never seen anything more beautiful. Kempenich snorted. Isaac might be his descendant, but he was an idealistic young fool. 7. "I'm Baron Isaac von Rumpelstiltskin, and I've finally come home," the bedraggled boy in a soaked tunic and hose said, as a pool formed on the cobblestones at his feet. It looked like he'd gone swimming in the river. A snort came from, was it his female companion? A girl no older than the Baron or Caterina herself, but dressed as simply as Caterina would be on any other day. Was she his servant? Isaac glanced back at the girl. "Oh, this is my betrothed, Lady Tessa, and her cat Sir Kempenich." "And you are?" He might not look like a courtier, or any nobleman Caterina had ever heard of, but he had the command and bearing of a man who was used to being obeyed, so she dared not dismiss him. "I am Mistress Caterina Steward, chatelaine of Burg Rumpelstiltskin, like my father before me," she said grandly, gathering her skirts to curtsy. She probably should have practiced this, but she hadn't expected for him to arrive so soon. She bobbed as gracefully as she could manage, then straightened again. "His Majesty sent word of your arrival, so I had the best bedchamber prepared, but there was no mention of your Lady Tessa." She'd almost said wife, but a wife would share his bedchamber, while the woman he was betrothed to, Caterina had no idea what the protocol was for that. Lady Tessa waved her hand in dismissal. "Oh, I'm sure Isaac's bed will be more than big enough for the both of us. What really matters to me is having a chamber with good lighting, where I might set up my loom." "What's up there?" She pointed at the highest tower. Caterina ducked her head. "That is the Baroness's bower, milady. Generations of ladies have claimed it for their own since the castle was built. I believe that very tower was built by the first Baron, for his lady wife." Another snort came from Lady Tessa's direction, followed by a distinctly male voice muttering, "Not me." Caterina was certain it had not been the lady who'd spoken. Tessa glared at her saddlebag. "You must excuse Sir Kempenich. Is not accustomed to long journeys, and gets quite grumpy when he's hungry. The grumpier he gets, the more human he sounds. After a few fish, he will be more himself again, and all he will say is meow. Isn't that right, Sir Kempenich?" The enormous golden cat rose from her saddlebag, gave her a withering look, then leaped down and sauntered toward Caterina as he eyed her suspiciously. "Meow," he said, for all the world like a man saying the word and not a cat's yowl at all. "He's gorgeous," Caterina said, dropping into a crouch so that she might stroke the cat's fur. "Soft too. With a loud, rumbly purr." "And he knows it too," Lady Tessa said, sliding off her horse. "So, Mistress Caterina, am I to understand you are good with cats and experienced at running a castle?" It didn't feel like a command, not like when the Baron spoke. And yet, Caterina feared if she did not answer to the girl's approval, she would not like the consequences. But Lady Tessa was a girl of her own age, wearing clothes no better than the ones Caterina herself owned. So Caterina looked her in the eye and said, "Yes, milady, I have kept this castle for more than 10 years, with an all-female clouder of cats who are all expert mousers, and you will find the castle cellars so free from rats and mice, they would satisfy even the queen herself." Lady Tessa coughed out a laugh. "I doubt the queen cares much about rats or mice, or mouses, for that matter. Sir Kempenich might be interested in some female company, though, wouldn't you?" At the sound of his name, the cat glared at her, as though he'd understood every word. Isaac stepped up to Lady Tessa's side, lifted his arm to lay it across her shoulders, then thought the better of it, as water dripped off his sleeve. "See, darling. I told you that there'd be a steward to help run the estate. You won't have to do a thing. I'm sure Mistress Caterina can even plan our wedding celebrations when you finally decide on a date." Lady Tessa shrugged. "I told you in the spring in the chapel here on your estate. After the snow melts. The chapel with the collapsed roof, beside where her father was buried." Caterina's heart sank, so she bobbed another curtsy to hide her chagrin. "A good time of year for a wedding, milady. After the snows all melted, and if the river does not flood its banks, I'm sure the chapel would be the perfect place for a small celebration. Of course, if you wanted a full court wedding, the chapel will be far too small. Perhaps the cathedral in the capital." "No. There will be no court wedding. Not now, not ever," Lady Tessa snapped. There was more to Tessa and Isaac's story than a simple court romance, Caterina suspected, and she couldn't deny a strong curiosity to find out their secrets. Tessa unstrapped her saddlebags and slung them over her shoulder as though they weighed nothing, before Caterina could open her mouth to summon a servant to assist her. "Can you show me up to this bower, then? The sooner I unpack and set up my loom, the better," Lady Tessa said grimly. "Of course, milady," Caterina said, leading the way. So much for seeing the Baron off quickly back to court. Both he and his betrothed were likely to stay here until at least next spring, and maybe even longer than that. Time that she could use to ferret out the couple's secrets, but also time for them to discover how badly the castle had crumbled under her aegis. No, her place here was not secure. Not by a long shot. At least there was always the curse. She could mention it the next time she saw the Baron, and hope that fear of being cursed himself, or worse, Lady Tessa falling victim to it, would send them both back to court. Though Lady Tessa might take some persuading. Caterina pressed her lips together, and headed up the tower stairs. She had time. 8. The silk-clad servant sent all of Kempenich's hackles up. Oh, she might claim to be the castle chatelaine, but she was still a servant, and no servant dressed like a queen, down to her silk stockings. Yes, he'd rubbed against them, just to be certain. When the castle crumbled but servants wore silk, something was definitely amiss. If the castle had a master, he'd have suspected the girl of being the man's mistress, showered with expensive gifts he could ill afford, when he should have spent his gold on improving his estate. But Isaac was the master here, and he'd only met the girl today. He'd spent more time looking at the castle than the chatelaine or his bride. Besides, the girl was far too young to have been the cause of what surely was years of neglect. Even if she had been managing the castle for a decade, could 10 years without repairs result in this much damage? Kempenich was not familiar enough with the construction of castles, to be sure. His own wooden house had required regular repairs, especially in the spring. But the girl's father might have given her the silk gown, for she'd said he was the steward before her. Now he'd likely been steward for more than 10 years, certainly time enough to steal the coin that should have gone into maintaining the castle and spending it on what, exactly? He followed the girl around the castle as she led Tessa to her tower, then headed down the kitchens to order dinner, before escorting Isaac up to the master's chambers. Aside from Isaac's room, the whole castle was sparsely furnished. The walls were bare, showing numerous patches of moss and mold where the roof had leaked in so many places. It was a wonder the floors weren't awash every time it rained. He flicked a paw and shuddered at the very thought of having to negotiate puddles in his own home. And this was his home, even if it had changed over time. He might be a cat, but he was still von Rumpelstiltskin, and this was Burg Rumpelstiltskin. The boy might be too busy rutting with his soon-to-be wife, but Kempenich would not let some mere girl distract him. No, he would save his family's fortunes again, and see this castle repaired to its full glory once more. The servant girl had to know where her father had hidden the gold. As the castle chatelaine, she had the keys to every storeroom and cellar. So Kempenich would simply follow her around the castle, until she inevitably led him to its hiding place. Easy. Or so he thought. 9. Kempenich expected dinner to be served in the Great Hall, where all the servants and peasants would be required to swear their allegiance to their new baron, but instead the platters of roast duck were carried to a more modest chamber above the hall, where a family-style table with benches stood, leaving the servants to stand along the wall. The only servant who sat down to table in this room was the chatelaine, Caterina. Kempenich took his place on the table beside her, glowering at the bare timber where there should have been a trencher. Tessa got the message without him having to open his mouth. "Can you get an extra trencher for Sir Kempenich, please?" she asked one of the servants, pointing at him. "He's quite fond of duck." Yes, he'd watched the chatelaine catch them with the help of a falcon and a hawk that very afternoon. He'd never seen a woman hawking before. It was a nobleman's sport after all, for it required strength to handle such fierce birds, but he had to admit he'd been impressed. The girl was certainly capable. Which made him believe she could not have been innocent in her father's thievery. No, someone who provided for and kept a castle of this size would have known what was going on. She must know where her father had hidden his ill-gotten gains, and she would lead him to it eventually. "So, how do you like Burg Rumpelstiltskin, my lord?" the chatelaine asked, sipping from her wine cup. A cup that did not belong at a servant's lips, Kempenich fumed. She should be dining with the servants in the kitchen. But he'd promised Tessa and Isaac that he would not speak, so he kept his counsel, and vowed to lecture them both on maintaining proper decorum later. "It is bigger than I imagined, and yet I confess I am disappointed," Isaac said. The girl grimaced. "How so, my lord?" Feigning innocence, as if she wasn't well aware of the castle crumbling around her. "My uncle wrote me a letter before he left the court, to seek his fortune as a knight for hire elsewhere. He spoke of my mother, his sister, and how she loved the views from the topmost tower. He also described the castle, and that I would know it from the golden lion that greeted me as I crossed the bridge. He urged me to pat its head for luck every time I passed it, for it was the guardian of my family's fortunes. Yet when I rode across the bridge today, I saw no such lion, and I fear I have courted bad luck by not obeying my uncle's instructions. How could I have missed it?" He said it shone like a beacon in the sun. The chatelaine set her cup down with a wince. The river flooded 6 years ago, and the whole bridge was under water, including the statue. When the waters receded, we found the statue on its side, so covered in muck it was unrecognizable. I had some men shift it beneath the battlements behind the drawbridge, hoping to find someone who might have the time and skills to repair the statue and set it back in its rightful place on the bridge. But then my father's illness drove him to his bed, and between nursing him and keeping the rest of the castle, the cat statue did not seem as important. I can see if there is someone in the village who might know what to do. A smith or a stonemason or something." Isaac waved away her concerns. "It does not matter. I've just spent all my childhood dreaming of a golden statue, so I wish to see it. There is only one golden statue at court, and it is a likeness of the previous king. A terrible likeness, for the man looks both furious and terrified at the same time, hardly the benevolent ruler history tells us kings should be. I always fancied he was looking at me accusingly, as if he knew my father had killed him, and that I was no better in his eyes. To see a golden statue that might bring me luck seemed like a dream come true. Perhaps the boy was not so foolish after all. Good luck was not to be dismissed, or allowed to remain besmirched in muck. Especially as he remembered the statue from his own time here, long before the castle or the current inhabitants had arrived. He vowed to find and restore the golden lion to his family's castle, along with its fortunes. But not until the chatelaine was safely asleep, and not likely to sneak off to count her illicit gold. for he would find both this statue and his family's fortune. 10. Caterina knew she was drinking too much wine, but it seemed rude not to match Isaac and Tessa, drink for drink, especially when she wanted to impress them with the fine, well-preserved vintages in the castle's cellars. The castle might be in need of repairs, but the cellars were so well stocked, they could dine like royalty for years. Worse was that the more time she spent in their company, the more she liked the pair. Isaac asked 1,000 intelligent questions about the castle, including some she regretted that she couldn't answer. Tessa mostly asked about the food, wanting to know all about the ingredients, or whether Caterina wanted more. Instead of gesturing for a servant to assist her, Tessa served Caterina herself, leaving Caterina powerless to refuse another cup of wine or another piece of the cook's specialty, roasted duck in plum sauce. Knowing that these were the last of the plums, and there would only be confit duck until the next crop ripened next summer, didn't help either, for blurting this out to Tessa only resulted in a spirited discussion about how both were prepared, which was very different in Tessa's homeland, Caterina discovered. She'd thought Tessa had come from the king's court, like Isaac, but she'd spent most of her life in the East, where light summer clothing was made from something called cotton instead of flax. Tessa promised to show her some of the stuff, if Caterina would teach her how to spin linen thread from the local flax. Lady Tessa was a passionate weaver, it turned out, and while she was perfectly happy to have someone else spin the thread or even sew the cloth once it was woven, she did like to weave the cloth for her own clothes herself. "After I set up my loom in the bower tomorrow, would you bring up some flax fiber to spin?" Tessa asked. Not willing to tell her she'd removed her spinning stuff from that chamber only yesterday, Caterina hastily agreed. "Have we missed the harvest festival? My uncle said the castle was usually overrun with people this time of year. Locals celebrating a successful harvest, traders on their way to wherever they sell things, and even hunting parties trying to fill their larders for winter." "Where is everybody?" Isaac asked. Caterina knew she had to tell them, but she didn't want to. It had been so long since there'd been anyone her age here at the castle, or even anyone who was decent company. Like everyone else, they'd flee from the curse, and leave her here to do as she'd always done. Keep the castle, even as it crumbled down around her ears. "If it's because of the rickety bridge, I'll see that it's mended within the week. When I'm finished with it, it will survive centuries of winter floods." The Baron himself, fixing a bridge? Caterina would believe it when she saw it. Sure, he seemed nice enough, but no courtier would ever stoop to working as a common laborer. Surely Lady Tessa would not approve. Caterina had no choice. She had to tell them. "It's because of the curse," she blurted out. "Everyone stays away from the castle because of the curse. No one wants to sleep under the castle roof in case it gets them, too. Even the servants return to their homes in the village at night." Now even the cat's eyes were upon her. "I've never seen any evidence of a curse, and I've lived here all my life, like my father before me. But they say the curse was what got the previous Baron, made him mad, before it eventually killed him." Isaac's father, she remembered, before pressing her lips together, so no other outlandish rumors would escape. Isaac's eyebrows shot up. He wasn't mad, but he was a traitor. "He killed the king to save the queen, so that I might be able to break the curse. It cost him his life, but I did not let his sacrifice go to waste. There was a curse, but it is broken now, and I have the queen's favor too. No one else will ever fall victim to this curse, and never again will my family trust their fortunes to a witch." Lady Tessa swayed in her seat. "I believe I have drunk too much wine. Will you help me to bed? I fear I cannot remember the way." Isaac's fierce mien melted into concern for his bride-to-be, as he scooped her up in his arms to carry her to their bedchamber. Leaving Caterina alone with Lady Tessa's cat, who'd spent most of the meal looking down on her, as though he heartily disapproved of her. It was probably just his normal expression, Caterina told herself. He was a cat, after all. She rose from her seat, suddenly as tipsy as Lady Tessa. Unfortunately, she did not have a besotted baron to carry her to bed. Just a disapproving cat, twining around her ankles, threatening to upset her already questionable balance. She tottered up the stairs, feeling more than a little triumphant when she made it to her chamber without tripping, only to find the cat had come with her. Evidently the creature did not sleep with his mistress. Caterina stripped down to her shift and crawled under the covers. She could feel the cat's eyes on her, disapproving yet expectant. She patted the bed beside her. "You can sleep here if you wish." A long moment passed, before the soft thump told her the cat had accepted her offer. Caterina smiled. She suspected he'd be a far better behaved bedfellow than the Baron would be for Lady Tessa. So she snuggled deeper into her bed, and drifted off to sleep. 11. The chatelain's bedchamber was exactly what Kempenich would have expected of a high-ranking servant. A simple bed, though nothing as grand as the one in Isaac's chamber, with a small chest that no doubt held her belongings. He'd already peeked inside when she'd opened it, so he knew she wasn't hiding any gold in there, nor under the bed. He'd seen enough of her body to know she was soft, plump, and well-fed. Well, he'd seen that at the table too, where she'd eaten as heartily as Isaac. She lived like she was the lady of the house. But she slept in a linen shift, not a silk one. And all the clothes in her chest had been wool or linen too. As if the silk gown and stockings she'd worn today were the only silk she had. Had he been wrong about her? Surely not. She was hiding something, and he would find it. One way or another. But first, he needed to restore his family's luck. A golden cat to hunt a golden lion. The chatelaine had thoughtfully left her chamber door ajar for him, so Kempenich padded out without having to wake her. She'd said the statue was in the gatehouse, so that's where he headed. He'd followed the chatelaine around the castle all day, but it wasn't until now that he truly appreciated the size of the place. And wished he'd put on his boots, for the miles of flagstone floors were not kind to his paws. A cool breeze blew across the river, chilling the stones in the gatehouse even further. The drawbridge was down with no one standing guard, something no knight of his time would have allowed. Why, anyone could have come inside the castle walls to attack them. Yet the bridge and the road beyond were empty of enemy armies, or even enemy assassins. Perhaps the curse was deterrent enough. Then again, once the world learned that Isaac had broken the curse. The curse that Kempenich had asked the witch to cast on him, that had somehow been passed down to all his descendants, leaving Isaac as the sole survivor in this cursed, crumbling castle. Kempenich sighed. This was his fault, and he would fix it. In the gatehouse, surrounded by a nest of corroded chains that looked like they might break if anyone tried to pull up the drawbridge, he found a big, black lump that might have been the statue, or a particularly shaggy black sheep. Muck coated the thing so thickly it could have been any animal with 4 legs, or even a piece of furniture someone had pulled out of the river. It certainly smelled bad, like decaying plant matter. Kempenich stretched up and dug his claws into the stuff, figuring he could do more with them sharpened than without. Only his claws snagged on it and wouldn't come free. Even when he put his full weight on, by all that was holy. The whole thing came toppling over, pinning him beneath it. To hell with not talking. Kempenich let out a string of the worst curses he knew. He should have brought boots and a sword and a bloody big axe. All he had was fur and teeth and claws, and a puny body that could be squashed by a statue. A statue that was supposed to bring his family luck, damn it. Kempenich had heard of berserkers, warriors among the Northmen who could summon a battle frenzy that made them as strong as 10 men. He'd never believed it before, but the anger rising in his breast now was more than his feline body could handle. More than any normal man could handle. If he had 10 men, he would slice this statue to pieces. In a frenzy of claws, teeth, and a roar that he fancied was more likely to come from a lion than a house cat, Kempenich unleashed his fury on the hapless statue. An eternity later, though it was likely less than an hour, for the night was still dark, Kempenich sat on his haunches and licked his paw. The muck tasted as foul as it appeared, but it no longer besmirched the statue. A statue he remembered being bronze, but was now undoubtedly solid gold. It had been bronze when he'd arrived home from the witch's cottage, reaching out to touch it, before his vision had gone black and he'd known no more, until awakening in Lady Tessa's tower. Was this his family's fortune? All the gold that had not gone into repairing the castle? Yet it was hardly hidden, and certainly not stolen. It had been sitting in plain sight, even if it had been covered in muck. Isaac's uncle had remarked on it 20 years ago, which meant it had been on display even then. So what of the last 2 decades of tithes? No, there had to be more gold in the castle than one statue. If it even was gold. Kempenich nudged it upright, so that he could walk around it to get a better look at it. Without the muck coating it, it truly did look like gold. Bronze would need polishing, but this shone even in the moonlight. Well, there was one way to truly tell if it was gold. He leaped on the statue's back, digging his claws into the soft metal, and bit down on the statue's mane. Light blazed, blinding him as he flew through the air until his back hit a wall. Winded, he slid down to the ground, where blackness engulfed him. Just like last time. Some hours later, when the sky was lightening toward dawn, Kempenich regained consciousness. The statue still mocked him, so he gave it a wide berth as he clambered to his feet and staggered back to the chatelain's chamber. He flopped onto the bed, and promised himself he'd resume his search for the lost gold in the morning. 12. Caterina usually didn't pay much attention to her dreams, but tonight they were more vivid than usual. Perhaps it was seeing the way Isaac and Tessa cared for one another, for it was obvious their betrothal was a love match, and not just some political ploy, making her wish there was such a match for her in her future. Not that she'd ever met a man she'd wanted to share a future with, but when she dared imagine one, she'd wanted someone big and protective and capable. Someone who'd carry her to bed, like Isaac had done for Tessa, and protect both her and the castle like some warlord of old. A knight who led armies into battle, instead of promising to build bridges. A man who'd be the master of their bedchamber, where she wouldn't have to do anything but lie back and enjoy all the pleasure he could give her, for if she was making up a fantasy man, he would have to be an amazing lover, too. Good with his hands and his mouth and other parts of his anatomy, so that she'd want to share his bed, instead of having separate chambers, like the Baron and Baroness were supposed to have. She dreamed he crept into bed beside her, sliding beneath the covers, as he wrapped his strong arms around her, pulling her hard against his body. She stripped off her shift, wanting to feel his skin against hers, as his hands roamed her body, stroking and caressing as his lips kissed her neck. She'd never dreamed a man's hands would feel so good on her breasts. It made her ache right down to her core. In fact, she slid a hand between her thighs, wanting to soothe that particular ache first. Only his hand followed hers, thick, calloused fingers rubbing her harder than she'd ever dared, spearing inside her until she knew she was going to burst with pleasure. "Come for me, Aeneas," he growled in her ear. Who was Aeneas? She reached behind her and got a handful of, good heavens, was that his manhood? It was enormous. And definitely not a dream. There was a huge man in her bed, with his hands all over her. Caterina screamed. 13. Her scream cut him to the core, for it was not a scream of pleasure, but one of terror. Kempenich had always been swift to answer the call to battle, and tonight was no exception. In a moment, he'd girded his loins with the nearest piece of cloth, ripped his sword from the wall, and now he brandished it against the intruder, who dared to interrupt him making love to his wife. "Show yourself," he roared. "I am Sir Kempenich von Rumpelstiltskin, and intruders are not welcome in my home. I shall cut you down where you stand, for frightening my lady." The sound of running feet, running toward him, not away from him, confused Kempenich. Surely any sensible intruder would flee. Then again, they'd been fool enough to enter his house, so. Isaac appeared, with Tessa not far behind him. Isaac just gaped, so it was Tessa who spoke first. "Good morning, Sir Kempenich. Nice apron." She nodded at his nether regions. Kempenich glanced down. In his hurry, he'd wrapped Anir's apron around his hips, where it barely covered the essentials. Hardly a fitting sight for a lady. He swallowed and ducked his head. "My apologies, Lady Tessa. I thought there was an intruder, and—" He brandished his sword, which wasn't his sword at all. His sword had a greater reach, and a more ornate hilt, as befitted his station. Oh, not silver or gold or bejeweled, but carved with the ripples of the river, reminding him of home. And Anir, oh by all that was holy. "Are you all right, Caterina?" Tessa asked. The chatelaine, not Anir at all, clutched the bedclothes to her breasts, and pointed at Kempenich. "He was in my bed. You invited me to sleep there," Kempenich said. As if a knight of his station would share a woman's bed without an invitation. "I've never seen you before in my life," the chatelaine protested. "Ah. Did you, by any chance, allow my cat to sleep on your bed?" Tessa asked. The chatelaine reddened. "Well, yes, but that man is not a cat." Tessa eyed him. "Not anymore, no. Sir Kempenich, would you care to explain why you are now yourself instead of a cat?" Kempenich glanced down again, but this time he looked at more than his makeshift loincloth. He had legs and hands, and he was— Praise the heavens, the curse is truly broken. For only a curse could possibly have turned him into a cat. Tessa sighed. "Yes, well, I imagine we'll need to find you a room to sleep in, for it sounds like Caterina has no wish to share her bed with you now that you're— you." She turned to the chatelaine. "Please forgive him. He had the misfortune to be transformed into a cat, and we thought bringing him home with us would be the safest place for him. He is family, after all. A distant cousin of Isaac's. More like his many times great-grandfather," Kempenich thought but didn't say, for a cousin would not have passed the curse down to Isaac. Only a direct descendant. Kempenich apologized to Caterina. "You scared her." Kempenich did not take orders from women, but the firm set of Tessa's mouth told him it would be safer to obey her than risk her ire. He'd been cursed by a witch in the past, and while he did not know what Tessa's powers were, he did know she possessed them. He lowered his sword, and sketched an elaborate bow toward the chatelaine. "Please forgive me for frightening you, Mistress Caterina. I fear falling asleep as a cat, and waking as a man, made me forget my manners entirely." Though he would not forget the softness of her breasts in his hands in a hurry. Perhaps he could seduce the secrets of his family's stolen treasure from her. She'd certainly responded to him eagerly enough, and her eyes raked his body even now. "Yes," she snapped. She turned away from him to address Tessa. "If you could remove Baron Isaac's cousin from my chamber, I'll see to it that he has his own room prepared as soon as possible, for he is not welcome here." "Make sure it has a big bed," Kempenich said. "I'm a big man, after all." And he intended to share that bed with her, in time. Caterina flushed most prettily, all the way down to the swell of her breasts, which peeked out the top of the bedclothes. He would enjoy seducing her. Tessa seized his arm. "Sir Kempenich, please lower your sword. It's time to demonstrate that discretion is the better part of valor, or I shall throw a bucket of water over you." You have been a tomcat for too long." She had surprising strength for someone so small as she tugged him out of the room. "She did invite me into her bed, Lady Tessa." "I swear it," Kempenich protested. "I would never seduce a woman who was unwilling." "You'd better be telling the truth, Sir Kempenich, because I'd hate to have to castrate you. With a sword like that, I imagine you're quite skilled." Tessa shot him a wicked smile and a wink over her shoulder as she led him away. "But you'd better stay away from the lady's bed until she invites you back, just to be safe." Almost as if the witch could read his mind. Kempenich shivered and went where she led. He'd crossed enough witches in his life, and endured the consequences. Maybe when he restored Isaac's family fortunes, she might look kindly on him. He certainly hoped so, for a woman who could break a curse like the one on his family could surely cast worse, if he offended her. 14. "Are you certain Sir Kempenich did not hurt you?" Tessa asked when Caterina had her hands full of flax. "Hurt? No." He'd shocked her by being real, but when she'd thought him a dream, his attentions had been anything but painful. The memories of this morning would likely fuel her fantasies for months to come. She'd been so close to the peak of her pleasure, a peak higher than she'd ever attained on her own. If Sir Kempenich had not called her the wrong name. "No, milady." "The moment I realized there was someone else in my bed, I screamed." And his first action had been to grab the sword off the wall and defend her, despite being nearly naked. Like some hero of old. It was almost romantic. She wasn't sure what she'd liked more, the view of his muscles as he'd raised his sword in her defense, or the way his hands had played with her body before he'd reached for his sword. If she was some marriage-minded miss, she might have set her cap on him then and there. As the Baron's cousin, his station was at least equal to hers if not higher. But Caterina had a castle to keep, while Sir Kempenich was a knight whose lady's name was Aenir. A lady he would no doubt return to, now he was no longer a cat. "Then it is fortunate he managed to break the curse that made him a cat in your bed, and not mine. I fear Isaac would have run him through with his sword if he'd transformed in our bed, family or no." Caterina found that hard to imagine. Isaac seemed so nice. Even now, he was down by the river with some men from the village, repairing the bridge. She couldn't imagine him skewering someone with a sword, let alone the huge, muscled Sir Kempenich. "I think I much prefer weaving to spinning. This flax is so dry compared to silk or cotton. Would you be terribly offended if I left you to your spinning, while I work on my loom?" Lady Tessa asked. Of course Caterina could not refuse her. She was the future Baroness, and her employer, after all. What Caterina really wanted to ask was how Tessa had managed to bring her loom here. She and Isaac had only 2 saddlebags apiece, and Tessa had carried hers up the tower stairs in one hand. Yet half the tower room was given over to a loom made of red lacquered wood, polished to a high sheen, the like of which Caterina had never seen, and she'd inventoried every stick of furniture in the castle in her time here. Unless they'd left their pack horses or a cart in the village and sent them up later. But no, that could not be. Isaac was repairing the bridge, and he'd been particularly insistent that no one was to cross it until the work was done. He'd thrown a temporary wooden bridge across the river, more of a raft anchored on both banks than a real bridge, but he'd decreed that no more than 2 men at a time might cross it, and no horses. That wasn't all Lady Tessa had brought either. Now there were 2 mirrors in the room, and the second was even larger than the first. Caterina had suggested moving it into the Baron's bedchamber, so Lady Tessa could see her reflection when she dressed, but Tessa had shaken her head and said the mirror belonged in her workroom, not where she slept. Lady Tessa had many secrets, Caterina suspected, and it would take time to win her trust so that she might confide in her. But that was exactly what she must do, because she didn't dare risk offending the new Baroness and getting sent away. The Burg was her home, and so it must remain. Do Sir Kempenich and Baron Isaac not get along? Caterina asked. Lady Tessa laughed. I don't believe there's anyone Isaac does not get along with. He is possibly the most amiable man I ever met. Why, he even manages to remain on good terms with the king and queen. Why do you ask? Caterina chose her words carefully. Just that you said the Baron would run his cousin through with his sword. I couldn't imagine doing such a thing to a member of my family, someone I've known all my life. There. It didn't sound like she was being too nosy, asking more about Kempenich's past. Oh, they barely know each other. In fact, Isaac has known me longer than is known Kempenich, and the whole time Kempenich was a cat. Caterina dipped her hand in the bowl of water, and reached for more flax. But they both trained as knights at court, did they not? They trained at different courts. Isaac was raised as the Queen's ward, among her own children, in the capital, while Kempenich's father served a different king, and Kempenich travelled and trained with them. Kempenich has slain men in battle, while Isaac, well, I'm sure he's skilled enough with a sword, training every day with the princes and all, but while Kempenich would reach for his sword at the first sign of trouble, Isaac is more likely to build bridges and conquer hearts, instead of skewering them. The sound of swords clashing drifted up from the courtyard below. Caterina rushed to the window. Is that? Lady Tessa leaned in behind her. It looks like Isaac and Kempenich are sparring. I'm sure it was Kempenich's idea, though it appears is regretting it already. It has been some time since he's held anything larger than a dagger, and Isaac always made it a point of honor to be better with a blade than any of the princes. Maybe if the bout goes on long enough, they'll take their shirts off. She winked. Caterina drew back from the window. I'm sure I do not need to see such a thing. Someone might get hurt. Only bumps and bruises. Isaac is a veteran of the practice yard. He will not hurt Kempenich any more than Kempenich wants to hurt him. Come, I insist. If you have not seen men dance like this before, you absolutely must. It's mesmerizing. And once the shirts come off, did you see the muscles on Kempenich this morning? They don't make men like that these days. Tessa sighed. Caterina felt her cheeks grow hot. I averted my eyes, she lied. Tessa's own eyes were far too knowing. Aha! You averted them right down to that fine ass, hanging out the back of your apron for all the world to see. I had to walk behind him going up the stairs, and I definitely got an eyeful. Ooh, there go the shirts. Now we can have a proper show. She leaned out the window. My favor goes to the winner, she shouted. Isaac acknowledged her with a wave, never taking his eyes off Kempenich, but Sir Kempenich's gaze rose to the window, where it skewered Caterina as surely as any sword. Or that enormous. Sir Kempenich grinned and blew her a kiss, before turning his attention back to Isaac. For the first time in her life, Caterina thought she might swoon. 15. It took Kempenich 3 days before he could even land a blow on Isaac, and a full week before he could win a bout. All the while, he knew Caterina was watching from the tower windows above. He should be up there, trying to seduce her, but as the chatelaine rarely left Tessa's side and now she knew how poor a warrior he'd become during his sojourn as a cat, he'd limited his efforts to trying to get into her good graces at meals, by sitting beside her and serving her as he asked about her day. Not once did she let slip even the slightest hint about hidden gold, making Kempenich doubt himself again and again. That he could have mistaken her for Aenir that night in her bed. Aenir was gone along with the house they'd shared. Caterina shared her bronze hair, but that was where the similarities ended. Caterina was softer and sweeter, and everything he wanted right now. Enough. Tessa roared down from her tower window. Isaac and Kempenich immediately sheathed their swords, and gave her their attention. "That's the second shirt you've ripped this week. They're too small for you, Kempenich, and I'm sick of mending them when you tear through Isaac's shirts like paper. Caterina, there must be some suitable clothing for him somewhere in the castle. Can you find him something to wear?" A pause, during which the chatelaine likely answered in the affirmative. "Good. Right, Kempenich. You go with Caterina, and no more swordplay unless you're wearing your own clothes, or nothing at all." Kempenich saluted her. "As you command, Lady Tessa." He tugged off the torn shirt, then started on his hose, just in time to see Caterina burst from the tower, red-faced. "Sir Kempenich, you'll catch a chill," she cried. "I'm merely obeying Lady Tessa's wishes," he said. "I'm not sparring with you, naked man. Tessa's right. Let Caterina find you some clothes, so you'll stop tearing mine. Besides, I have a roof to replace before nightfall if the stable boys have cut enough shingles for me." Isaac marched off, leaving Kempenich with Caterina, and Tessa glowering down at them both. Caterina turned away. "If you'll follow me, Sir Kempenich." Now that he could do all day, his eyes firmly fixed on her lovely round bottom as it swayed beneath her skirt with every step. Until she stopped to open a door to a long, narrow room with chests lining the walls. Kempenich's heart dared to hope. Had she finally led him to the castle's secret treasury? Caterina flipped open the clasp on the nearest chest, and hefted the lid open. Then she did the same with the next, and the next. By the time she'd opened them all and raised a lantern so that he might see inside the nearest one, Kempenich knew fate did not favor him quite as much as he'd hoped. Oh, he'd caught the glint of gold in the lantern light, but every time it was the sheen of silk or fur or the occasional button or brooch, still fastened to a garment whose owner no longer had need of such things. These belonged to all the barons who came before, and some of the stewards too. Kempenich paced the length of the room. He'd never seen so many chests in one place in his life, and they were all full of clothing. "So many," he breathed. "A consequence of the curse, my father told me. All of the barons of Burg Rumpelstiltskin died young, so young they often did not live long enough to wear out their clothes. His curse. The one he'd asked for. It was supposed to provide for his family, but instead it had killed them. He'd been such a fool." "What of the baronesses? Are there clothes here too?" he asked. Caterina shook her head. While the barons did not survive, someone had to raise their sons to rule in their place. For centuries, Burg Rumpelstiltskin has been run by women. Most of them lived to see their children and grandchildren marry and raise children of their own, before they were laid to rest in the churchyard. Only the most recent baroness, Baron Isaac's own mother, died in childbirth, and her things are stored in the bower, just as she left them. Kempenich nodded. "Which is why you run the castle now, despite not being its lady." Caterina shrugged. "A great number of people depend on the estate for their survival, and in the absence of a baron or even a baroness, I do what I must. Which I will continue to do, as long as Baron Isaac and Lady Tessa permit it." Perhaps he'd been looking in the wrong places. The treasure might not be kept here at all, but among the people Caterina cared for, living on Rumpelstiltskin lands. Taking care of family is important. "Where are yours?" She gave him an odd look. "My father is buried in the churchyard, like the other stewards before him. Right alongside my mother, which is what he wanted." Kempenich sighed. "So the treasure was here. Let us look at these clothes then." Caterina rummaged through first one chest, then another, but after everything in four of them had been deemed too small, even she was looking distinctly irritated. "I'm afraid men from the past were not as well nourished as yourself or even Baron Isaac, so they were of much smaller stature. If I cannot find something suitable from the more recent barons, I doubt anything older will fit you." She waved at the line of chests, still waiting to be examined. Kempenich began to feel foolish just standing there in his birthday suit, waiting for her to dress him. Perhaps he should take matters into his own hands. Especially as he knew men of his time had most definitely been his size, no matter what the chatelaine believed. I'll start at that end. The chests grew plainer the longer he walked, as though the family fortunes had increased over time, resulting in more ornate furnishings. Would he find his own clothes and armor here, if he searched hard enough? He wasn't sure whether he wanted that or not. It would be wonderful to have his own things again, but explaining to the chatelaine how armor from 4 centuries past fit him perfectly might prove a challenge. The first chest he chose had no carvings on the outside whatsoever, and there was not a hint of silk to be seen. Golden toggles glinted on plain wool though, as he lifted a promising-looking tunic out of it to hold against his chest. No, this one was too small too. He set it down and continued rummaging through the chest. Beneath the layers of wool and linen, he found a complete suit of clothing in cloth of gold. Tunic, cloak, undershirt, even hose. It was clothing fit for a king, or maybe even an emperor, which did not belong with the simpler garments that surrounded it. Unfortunately, it looked to be the same size as the wool tunic he'd discarded, so Kempenich moved on to the next chest. He'd gone through 3 chests before he found a linen tunic that might fit him, though age had yellowed it into pale gold instead of its original cream. The cloak beneath it had aged better, for both the wool weave and the fur lining were brown. Yet when he lifted it out, he found it hid yet another cloak, made of cloth of gold. "Why did the barons wear so much cloth of gold?" he muttered. "Oh, they didn't. Wear it, I mean. Turning things to gold was the first sign of the curse, my father said, and it came upon most of them suddenly. One night everything would be normal, but when he woke up the next morning, everything he touched turned to gold. Door handles, cups, his own clothing. Sometimes even the Baroness, before they learned to keep separate rooms for her safety. My father told me one of the barons had owned a gold chamber pot for a time, before he melted it down into coin. Father also said the barons possessed a pair of enchanted gloves that allowed them to touch things without turning them, but sometimes they forgot to wear them, and, well, you don't think how many times a day you smooth down your own clothing until one touch can turn everything to gold." She smiled sadly. "The late Baroness had a few golden gowns, but as I knew they'd been touched by the curse, I mostly left them in the chest in her bower." She frowned. "Are you sure what Baron Isaac said is true, about the curse being broken? I would hate to see him or Lady Tessa afflicted by it. Perhaps I should remove those gowns so they don't somehow pass the curse on to her." Kempenich snorted. It was Lady Tessa who broke the curse, and it would take more than a golden gown to tempt her into silliness. As for Isaac, can you imagine him wanting to wear gold? The boy would rather dangle in the river in his undergarments, fixing a bridge, than walk around like a blinding statue. Why keep any of it? You should sell it all. The cloth of gold, at least. It might bring in enough coin to cover the cost of repairs to the castle, and servants who will actually stay. Caterina shook her head. Who could afford to buy such costly garb? Not even the king could afford one golden tunic or cloak, let alone a whole chest full of them. And if anyone knew what the curse could do, a man who could turn anything to gold with a touch would be worth more than a king's ransom. The king himself would lock him in his dungeon, and force him to make enough gold to make him the richest man in the world. Why any man would want that? They would storm the castle and kill us all to possess the Baron. And if they discovered Baron Isaac could not turn things to gold, why, they would kill him too. I may not be a Rumpelstiltskin by name, Sir Kempenich, but I have lived here all my life, as have my family before me. I have sworn to hold this castle against all who would see it fall, and I will uphold my oath even to my last breath." His mouth had gone dry. Put a sword in her hand, and this woman had the determination to hold off an army. He feared he was in love. He glanced down. And painfully, glaringly in lust too. He reached for the yellowed tunic. Maybe I should try this on. I can't man the gate naked, after all. 16. Caterina should have kept her eyes on the chest in front of her, but her gaze kept straying to the naked man in the room with her. Sizing him up to see whether the clothing in the chest would fit him, she told himself, but even she knew it was a lie. She'd never met a man as large as Sir Kempenich, and while he was definitely too big for her bed, she wanted him there anyway. But she would not succumb to his charms, no matter how much she wanted to. If she shared a man's bed, the bed would be hers as much as his, and it would be their marriage bed, right here in the castle. And by the time she found a suitable man, Sir Kempenich would surely be far away, making love to the lady he'd already bedded, or fighting some foreign war that meant little to her. But right now, she could still look at that well-muscled backside, clearly visible as the tunic he donned rode up as he leaned over to pull something else out of the chest he'd chosen. Boots. My kingdom for a pair that fit. They were only half boots, the leather cracked from age, but from the delight in Kempenich's expression as he slid his feet into them, Caterina would not have been surprised to see a pair of ermine riding boots, trimmed with gold. Whatever court he'd been raised in, it was definitely very different to the one here. Where did you earn your knighthood, Sir Kempenich? She asked. I was knighted by King Carl the Great himself, he said, leaning over the chest again. Caterina had not heard of that particular king. Perhaps his kingdom was in the east, where Lady Tessa had lived. Will you return to his service soon? She asked. He let out a short laugh. Not unless some miracle brings him back to life. He's dead, and his heirs did not share his strength, so his empire is no longer what it once was. Warrior kings lead crusades now, instead of worrying about the barbarians within their own borders, or so I hear. He'd made a pile of things at his now booted feet, and he gestured toward it. These will do, I think. Though if you have a skilled leather worker, I would not object to some new boots and armor, too. Leather armor. Don't knights wear metal armor? Father went to a tourney once, and he said all the banging and clanging made his head ring. He couldn't understand how the knights withstood it. Kempenich stared at her in surprise. Then he seemed to recover. Perhaps tawny knights do. I would not know. Riding into battle, I prefer armor that is swift and light. Being just a bit too slow also makes you a bit too dead, or so my father would say. Caterina wet her lips. And where does he live now? He doesn't. Is buried within these walls, just like your father, but don't ask me where. It was too long ago for me to remember. She nodded. She could understand that. Perhaps Kempenich did not wish to tell her where he would go when he left the burg, and it was probably better that way. For if she knew, she might be tempted to leave and follow him, and that would be foolishness indeed. And she was no fool. Instead, she turned her attention to more practical matters. Are those the clothes you've claimed, Sir Kempenich? I'll see to it that one of the laundresses takes care of them, and have them sent up to your chamber when they are washed. Yes. Thank you, he said, and wandered out. Wearing nothing but a short tunic that barely covered his arse, and a pair of boots without hose or socks to cushion them. He was the strangest knight she'd ever met. 17. On Sunday afternoon, after visiting the church in the village, Caterina paid her weekly visit to her father. She told him about Isaac's repairs to the castle, as well as the bridge, and how he'd already sent word to the Queen for some of her apprentices to come and help with some of the bigger works, like the crumbling outer walls or the roof over the Great Hall. I wish you could see it, father. The burg truly will not fall as long as Isaac is the baron here. I only hope he's right, and he truly has found a way to stave off the curse. Though if he has not, some gold would not go amiss in convincing masons and carpenters to come to the castle. Fear of the curse keeps everyone away. Well met, Mistress Caterina. The sound of his voice did strange things to her belly, and the regions below it, too. Caterina rose to her feet, and dusted off the skirt of her Sunday best gown. The blue dye was costly, but the color was too pretty for her to resist, which was why this was her best dress, and the only one in blue linen. Sir Kempenich, she said, bobbing a slight curtsy. She opened her mouth to ask him what he was doing in the churchyard, before she remembered their conversation in the storeroom with all the clothing chests, and closed it again. If you're looking for your father's grave, you won't find it here. All the Rumpelstiltskin men are interred in the chapel crypt. Only women and servants are buried here. Was it frightening or heartening to think that one day her body would join them? Caterina wasn't certain. I'm not looking for my father. I came looking for you, he said. Angels sang paeans of joy in her head, but Caterina knew they were wrong to do so. What do you require, Sir Kempenich? I've instructed one of the maids to collect your clothing for washing, and return it to you, after washing day. That's tomorrow, so if you could but leave your dirty laundry in a pile by the door, I'm sure she can. Strong arms seized her as his hot mouth claimed hers. The angels only sang louder. Heavens, he tasted amazing, as his body molded to hers. Or was she molding to him? He was the one who was all hard muscles after all, while she was, well, plump. But with one hand on her rump, and another cupping her breast, Sir Kempenich seemed to be perfectly happy with that. He kissed her until she was breathless, and then he kissed her some more. A joyful eternity passed before his lips left hers, leaving her with such intense longing, tears sprang to her eyes. I cannot stop thinking about that night you invited me into your bed, he growled, pressing her body against his, so she could feel his hard manhood between them. The night I invited a cat into my bed. A cat who turned into you, who mistook me for someone named Aeneas and took liberties, she made herself say, instead of admitting how much she thought about that night too. You should come to my bed tonight, so that I can finish what we started that night. Give you the pleasure we both wanted. Yes, 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 the angels sang, as other parts of her anatomy provided their own, more base approval. And Aeneas? She asked coldly, even as her body melted against him. He raked his hand through his hair, though his other arm tightened around her. Aeneas has nothing to do with this. With us. She would understand. Caterina wrenched herself out of his grasp. No, it is I who understand. You wish to seduce me, like any common servant, so that I may warm your bed while you are here, and then when you are done, you will leave and return to Aeneas, who will no doubt welcome you back with open arms, no matter how faithless you might be. I should ask Baron Isaac where she lives, so that I might send a messenger, bearing a letter telling her how you behave when you are away from home. You might think women are fools, but we know it is men who behave far more foolishly. Riding away to war, staying in your cousin's castle, seducing his servants, does she even know where you are? Or whether you will return to her? You are no knight, Kempenich. Knights at least have honor, and you have none. Nor will I let you steal mine. She swept out of the churchyard, forcing her feet to carry her away from the man she desperately wanted to run back to. Even if he was a lying, cheating louse, who belonged to another woman. Oh, the angels weren't singing now. And if she had her way, they never would again. 18. The chatelaine was an absolute minx. She'd kissed him just as ardently as he'd kissed her, then turned him down flat, leaving him with the hard-on from hell, and still no closer to finding the stolen family treasure. Ho, Kempenich! Can you bring me up some more shingles? Or better yet, a second hammer and more nails, so you can help me finish this before dark? Isaac called. It took him a moment to find Isaac, waving from the roof of the tallest tower. Kempenich cupped his hands to his mouth. "Isn't it a day of rest? What are you doing, working up there? Wouldn't it be more sensible to wait for the carpenter to arrive in the morning?" Isaac just grinned. "Ah, but it will rain tomorrow, and heaven forbid I allow Tessa to weave in a room with a roof that leaks. Come up and help me. You look like you could benefit from banging things with a hammer right now." It wasn't like he'd be banging anyone, or anything else more pleasurable. By all that was holy, the boy was right. Even if he was on top of a roof, so high in the air. Grumbling, Kempenich climbed up to join him. He'd never nailed shingles to a roof before, but Isaac was a good teacher, who soon had him hammering away to a rhythm that soothed him even better than swordplay. "I should have invited you up earlier. I'd have been finished in half the time," Isaac said, admiring his work. "Maybe you should have. Then I wouldn't have." No, he didn't regret kissing Caterina. But he did wish things had gone differently. How had he gone so wrong? "She seemed to like you well enough." "She didn't slap you or scream at any rate," Isaac said. "I'd rather she had. Instead, she told me I had no honor. As if a servant had the right to chastise a knight. She should be honored I chose her for a tumble in my bed. What kind of servants do you keep who do not know their place?" Kempenich grumbled, hitting the nail so hard the hammer bounced back and almost caught him in the nose. "Actually, she's not really a servant. I've been looking through the castle records, and it seems the stewards have been here since the first donjon was built on the island. And when the barons died young, that's who their brides married. Right back to the first steward, and a lady called Aenir, who ordered the construction of the donjon that now sits beside the gatehouse." Aenir. His Aenir married again. Did she? A remarkable woman, this Aenir. Not only did she raise the first baron, a boy named Julius, Kempenich blurted out. Isaac paused. "You know all this already?" "No, tell me about them." "About Aenir and Julius. Please," Kempenich begged. "She had several more children with the steward, Silvius. She also raised Julius's son, along with her other grandchildren, after he died. By the time she died, the first castle with the Great Hall was complete. Several other widows throughout the centuries married their stewards too, so that the two families remained closely related. Not my mother and not hers, obviously, and sometimes so closely related that the baron and the steward were half-brothers, but it appears that Mistress Caterina and I are cousins." Wonderful. Not only had he been turned down by the woman he wanted, but if he had succeeded in seducing her, it would have been so incestuous, he'd have damned both their souls forever. Kempenich set down his hammer. "I'm done. It is supposed to be a day of rest, after all." 19. You know, you don't have to stay here if you do not wish to. There is a whole world out there to be explored. Or you could go to court. I'm sure Isaac could write to the Queen and secure you a place there. She does like to collect intelligent young people, and while you are a little older than most of her apprentices, you would arrive with the additional experience of having run a huge castle. If you win her favor, she might have you running the whole of the capital next. Tessa's eyes didn't leave her loom, but Caterina knew she wasn't talking to herself. Caterina forced her gaze away from the window, and back to Lady Tessa. "I have no wish to travel, and even if I did, I promised my father on his deathbed that I would stay here. There was this prophecy, you see, made by the same witch, who told the late baron how to break the curse. I was never sure whether to believe it or not, seeing as the curse took the baron and turned him traitor and all, but if the curse truly is broken now, even if it was Isaac who did it and not his father, then perhaps her other prediction will come true too. She said that as long as steward blood dwelled within these walls, they would not fall. Tessa laughed. Future-sighted witches are rare, and their predictions are cryptic at best. What if I told you that you had the power to choose your future, and no witch or prophecy could hold sway over it, but once you make your choice, you will lay the foundation for a future that will continue for 1,000 years? Caterina shivered. It sounded eerily like the prophecy, which Tessa could not possibly have heard. Forgive me, milady, but that is not true. Should I displease you, you could send me away, and I would have no choice in the matter. Then the castle truly would crumble, because I wouldn't know the first thing about keeping it. If I were fool enough to try to send you away, in less than a day, my husband would come galloping after you to beg you to return. I can cook and sew and clean well enough to keep a cottage, or maybe the donjon by the gate, but this place is more than I can manage. This place is so huge, it will take all 4 of us to do it justice. Caterina dared to breathe again. Thank you, milady, but I do not understand. There is yourself and the Baron, of course, and you are kind enough to include me, but who is the 4th person you speak of? Sir Kempenich, of course. He is as essential as any of us. Perhaps even more so, for once all of us are gone, the future of Burg Rumpelstiltskin rests firmly on his sword. But what of his wife? Surely he will return to her. He cannot stay here forever. It was tempting enough having him here now, hewing shingles with his axe where she could see him from the window. If he didn't leave soon, she was bound to surrender to temptation and those strong arms. And Sir Kempenich's wife died many years ago, as did his son. We are the only family he has left, and this is his home as much as it is home to all of us. Aenir is dead? Caterina blurted out. The butterflies in her belly leaped for joy, even as her heart sank in grief for Kempenich. To lose his whole family, to have no one. Aenir would understand, he'd said. Heavens, had he meant that she was one of those singing angels, wanting her husband to be happy after she was gone? Yes, and his son, so if there is to be another Baron after Isaac, it will be up to Kempenich to provide an heir. Tessa caught her stricken look. Future-sighted witches might be rare, but they do exist. Isaac and I cannot have children. But Kempenich can, and his children will inherit Burg Rumpelstiltskin after we are gone. He must stay, or at least his children must, so that they may learn how to manage the estate. That's where you come in. Caterina's head whirled. Kempenich was not married. His wife was dead. He wasn't leaving. His children would hold the castle. Hold it for 1,000 years. But only if they carried steward blood. Her blood. She fixed her gaze on the cloth Tessa was weaving on her loom. It was the wrong way up, but from here it looked like the chapel in the churchyard, only whole again, with the roof repaired, and 2 couples standing on either side of the altar, hands clasped as though in prayer. Or a pledge. She blinked and the image was gone. She peered closer, wondering. Ow. My apologies, Caterina. It seems the trim on my sleeve has caught in your hair. Hold still while I untangle it. After it felt like Lady Tessa had tugged several strands of hair out of Caterina's scalp, she pronounced her free of all entanglements, and permitted her to move away again. Lady Tessa seemed transfixed by the hair caught in her embroidery, as she held it up to the light. Such a beautiful color. Almost gold, she mused. Aenir's hair was this color too, you know. I'm surprised he didn't tell you. Of course he hadn't. He'd been too embarrassed at calling her his dead wife's name that night in her bed. When she could have, she should have, and then the churchyard. God, she'd been such a fool. I think you'd make him a good wife. He's far too full of himself. Comes of being a cat for so long, I imagine, but you're not one to stand for his nonsense. He'd do anything for you. Why, he even followed you about the castle when he was still a cat, and when he was a cat, he didn't like anyone. Tessa's gaze was unblinking. "If you want my help to catch him, you shall have it. I care little for castles, but the Burg is important to Isaac, as it is to you. If you wish to see its future assured, as Isaac does, I will do everything within my power to secure that for you." Her expression softened into a smile. "You should probably call me Tessa. We will be family, and when you wed Kempenich, you'll be Lady Caterina, too." But there was something in Tessa's voice when she'd said everything within her power, as though her power was considerable, and not something to be easily dismissed. And hadn't Kempenich said it was Lady Tessa, not Isaac, who'd broken the curse? Surely that meant she was a witch too, and a powerful one. One who could magic a whole loom into a small saddlebag, and make it feather light. Perhaps even one of those rare witches with future sight. Caterina shivered, then dropped into a deep curtsy. "Yes, milady. On that day I will. But until then, she'd be very, very careful to do everything Lady Tessa said. Because she knew better than anyone what the consequences were of offending a powerful witch. They'd almost brought down Burg Rumpelstiltskin once, and she would not allow it to happen again." 20. "Sophia would never walk out with you," one of the stable boys taunted. "Oh yeah. Then why did she agree to walk down by the river with me after church on Sunday, and agree to meet me there again next week?" the other one returned. The first boy's jaw dropped. "But Sophia's father won't let her walk out with anyone. My father helped out her father when they were rebuilding the bridge with the new Baron. They're friends now, and he saw the Baron had taken me on as an apprentice. That's why Sophia is allowed to come walking out with me. I'm going to be a carpenter." "I wouldn't want to be a carpenter. I'd rather be a groom. I much prefer horses to axes." "Then you should go walking out with the innkeeper's daughter. If you married Bertha, her father might let you manage his stables, which are much busier than the Baron's. Now, maybe, but when the castle is repaired and everyone learns that the curse is broken, everyone will want to come and stay at the castle again. Only their servants will stay at the inn, while all the nobles with their fancy horses will be here. Do you know any of the castle maids? None of the maids will even look at a stable boy. Not when the Baron and his cousin are not yet married. They all want to be fine ladies." "Not everyone wants to be a fine lady, boys," Kempenich snapped. Caterina was all kinds of fine, lady or not, but she was as far out of his reach as a near. Even if she hadn't turned him down flat. "Are you going to marry one of the maids, Kempenich?" the first boy asked eagerly. "No. A good knight is wed to his horse and his weapons, with no need for a woman in his bed," Kempenich said. It was a lie he'd been fed many times as a squire, until he'd almost believed it, but Aenir had soon taught him the truth. Aenir, whose body lay here alongside the grave of the steward she'd married, keeping him from Caterina forever. "See that you keep working until the Baron returns," Kempenich said to the boys, burying his axe deep in the chopping block. He marched off toward the churchyard. He found her grave right up against the wall of the chapel. Their grave, in fact, for Silvius's name was on the stone as well as hers. Even in death, fate kept them apart. Was that his curse? Not gold or lack of it, but to never be allowed to love again. A fate he'd passed on to Julius and all those who came after him, none of whom were buried with their wives in the churchyard. No, they were all in the crypt, wherever that might be. Not out here, but perhaps in the chapel. He ducked inside, almost having to bend double beneath the collapsed roof, but the east end, where the altar and sanctuary stood, it was almost intact. Perhaps that said something about the holiness of the place, or maybe it was just luck. His luck today, for behind the altar was a trapdoor that he was certain led to the crypt. The hinges creaked when he opened it. He half expected something to fly out at him, Aeneas's ghost perhaps, or the ghosts of all his accursed descendants, ready to accuse him of dooming them to early deaths. They wouldn't be wrong. But no ghosts greeted him at all. Just a steep, narrow stair leading into the darkness. The chapel had candles aplenty, so he selected one in a sturdy holder to light his way. When he reached the bottom, he was surprised to see the crypt stretched far further underground than the small chapel above. Much like the chamber filled with chests, this one was lined with coffins along both sides. Big stone boxes with the names of their occupants carved on top. Kempenich raised his candle so he might read the inscription on the first one. Baron Julius von Rumpelstiltskin. He'd only been 21 when he died. And fatherless for 18 of those years. I did it for you. For all of you. Kempenich said. I thought if I could fix our fortunes, you'd be able to build a castle here when I was gone. And you did. Burg Rumpelstiltskin, an edifice that rivals even the king's own castle in the capital. But they hadn't, had they? Their wives and mothers and grandmothers had. All the men in his family had died young, while the women they should have been protecting ruled and fought and raised their children, only to watch them die. Burg Rumpelstiltskin had been built by women and the stewards they'd turned to when their menfolk were gone. Culminating in Caterina, a woman who was both steward and mistress of the castle, a vision of feminine perfection he could not have, because she was his many times great-granddaughter. He might as well want to marry Isaac. I'm here because you failed. Once again, it's up to me to restore the family fortunes, and heaven only knows if I'll manage to do a better job this time. And why did none of you bother to try and break the curse? Was only Isaac brave enough to attempt it? You're all cowards, the lot of you. You don't deserve the sacrifice I made. That all those women out there made for you. I don't deserve to be here. I gave you everything you needed to assure our family's fortunes. I didn't fail you. You failed me. There's no point shouting at them. They can't hear you, Isaac remarked as he ambled down the stairs. They're not here. It's just us. Where else am I supposed to shout at my descendants about how disappointing they are? It's not as though I had the chance to meet them in life. Even my own son could scarcely lift a wooden practice sword when the witch cursed me. Kempenich folded his arms across his chest, and leaned against coffin behind him. When you died, Kempenich, leaving your wife a widow. That's your coffin right there, with your body in it. She had this crypt and chapel built for you, before anyone else. She might have built the castle and everything else for those who came after, but this place was for you. I mean to rebuild it before the spring, when I hope you will stand beside me when I wed Tessa here. You are the only family I have. Well, you and Caterina, I suppose, though I'm your direct descendant and she's more of a cousin. Kempenich let out a bitter laugh. Which means you could marry her, but by the laws of consanguinity I cannot. Isaac looked puzzled. But she's no blood relation of yours. By marriage yes, but you do not share blood. My great-great however many times great-granddaughter not carry my blood? Are you suggesting my wife was unfaithful? Kempenich boomed. Isaac laughed. No, you fool. You died and she married another man before she gave birth to his son, both of whom were Caterina's great-great-great-grandfathers, not you. Julius was her blood, and all of these other men here were, because they were descended from Aeneas, not you. If you wanted to marry Caterina, not even the Pope himself could stop you. Now if the lady herself objects, that's another matter, but I spoke to Tessa last night, and she said that Caterina fears you will leave her to become a sword for hire, or to return to your wife. While I cannot stop you from selling your sword, I will admit it is rather rusty after all this time, and would be better used in defense of this castle, instead of someone else's. I've been looking through some of the records of this place, and it seems Burg Rumpelstiltskin is actually 3 separate castles, built together after the bridge and walls went up. The oldest is the donjon beside the gatehouse, followed by the building that holds the Great Hall, with the tallest section housing the Baroness's bower, the most recent construction. Now the donjon is small and more suited to a guard tower, and Tessa has laid claim to the tower, which leaves the castle anear, built for her growing family. As the only other man with Rumpelstiltskin blood running through your veins, however venerable that blood may be, it seems only fitting that you should have the castle your wife built, where you might raise a new family, if you are willing to take another wife. Kempenich's jaw dropped open. But what of your children? I would never forgive myself if my children tried to disinherit yours. Isaac shook his head. Tessa and I cannot have children. It's the reason the witch took her, and why she would not go back to her parents when we freed her. They would try to use her for a political marriage, and when she proved unable to bear her husband an heir, it would lead to war. Tessa! She was a witch, with power enough to make him pause, but she did not seem important enough to wage wars over. Who is she? She is the firstborn child of King Lubos and Queen Molina. The child my father killed the previous king for and died to protect. He turned traitor to save her life, because he knew she was the only one who could break the curse. She was born Princess Caterina, but you can never repeat that name. The queen believes she died in infancy at the hands of the witch who took her, and so it must remain. You're marrying a princess? Kempenich spluttered. He knew fate had brought him back to fix his family's fortunes, but he'd never thought to aim so high. He'd been so focused on the missing gold, figuring all that wealth would end all their family's problems. I will marry Lady Tessa, if she'll still have me, and I suggest you find a willing wife who'll have you too. We have a castle to keep, an estate to rule, and it all depends on there being some sort of succession. Children, which is where you come in. But how can we finish restoring the castle without gold? Kempenich asked. Stonemasons and carpenters cost money, and so does good timber and stone. That is where we thank the Queen, for she made sure my education was everything I would need. I am a master mason and carpenter, having served my apprenticeship in the capital, as well as a knight. I have only to send the Queen a gift, and ask her to send me some apprentices to train. We have stone and timber enough on these lands to build 3 more castles if we needed, and Tessa told me she found gowns made of cloth of gold in her bower. Perhaps the Queen would accept one of those as a gift, for Tessa refuses to wear them. Caterina showed me more cloth of gold clothes for men in one of the storerooms. Perhaps you can send a suit of clothes for the king as well. Isaac grinned. Now you're talking. They'll send me so many apprentices, I might need to find a better engineer to keep them busy. I'll see if I can pry my cousin Romain away from his wife and his windmills long enough for him to build a water wheel here. The river flows swiftly enough around the Burg that I think we might be able to install running water like they have in the capital, and a mill running on water power. Tessa will have all the linen thread she could possibly want for her loom, if we can build a mill to process the flax faster. What in heaven's name is a water wheel? Kempenich asked. Isaac clapped him on the shoulder. I will show you, but not before the spring. We have no need for gold. It is love and loyalty and hard work that will restore Burg Rumpelstiltskin, you'll see. Now, the ladies will be expecting us for dinner soon, so shall we leave this place and head up into the sunlight? Or are you curious to take a peek at your bones, and see if your wife buried you in your armor with your sword on your breast, like a true warrior? Kempenich shuddered. No man should see his own corpse, and no man should see his own bones. I say we should seek sunlight, not ancient swords that are probably rusted through. I'm sure there is something more suitable in your armory, if I ever find the place. You should ask Caterina. I'm sure she'd be able to find you the perfect sword. He paused on the first step, Oh, and Tessa says she would like a double wedding in the spring, when we have restored the chapel, so I hope that is enough time for you to ease your way into Mistress Caterina's good graces. Apparently, the castle is frequently snowed in during winter, but we have enough supplies to last us for at least 3 winters, but only Caterina knows where everything is stored. So if you do not wish to dine on pickled cabbage without meat or wine for several months, I suggest you get to work wooing her. Winter is coming, after all. 21. It was not yet Sunday, but Caterina wished very much to speak to her father again. About whether witches and curses and prophecies were real, and what she should do about Lady Tessa and Sir Kempenich. Obey the one and marry the other, she imagined, for that is what her own heart told her she should do, but she rarely made important decisions in haste, and there was no one else she could talk to. Lady Tessa was a little bit terrifying, and while she knew she needed to speak to Kempenich, she wanted to organize her thoughts inside her own head before she blurted out something silly to the man. Was it wrong to want him to woo her? To leap to her defense as he had that first night he'd transformed from cat to man? Oh, it was probably terribly wrong to want to share his bed again, but she could not deny she ached for him, all the same. So she sat with her back to her father's gravestone and spilled everything. Her worries, her concerns, her dark desires, which she never would have confessed to her father while he lived and breathed, and her hopes that somehow this would work out for the best. The more she talked, the calmer she became, until she lay down amid the cornflowers and drifted off to sleep. 22. When the time came to join the others for dinner, for the first time in his life, Kempenich's courage failed. Sure, he knew he needed to win Caterina's affection, but he truly had not the slightest idea how to do so. Aeneas had wooed him, not he her, and after Caterina had already refused him, he had little hope of her even looking at him favorably without some suitably grand gesture. So he took the coward's way out and demanded bread, cheese and a wineskin from the kitchens, and carried them out into the warm autumn evening to share a meal with Aeneas. Setting his back to the chapel wall, he stared at the engraved stone as he munched on his repast. I suppose the first thing I should do is beg you to forgive me. I knew I did not have long to live when I went to the witch, which was why I went to her in the first place. I wanted to see to it that you and Julius were provided for, when I was gone. I would have told you everything, if I'd had the time. I should have told you what I was planning before I went to the witch, but I didn't even know such a thing was possible until she'd already performed the spell, and then it was too late. Much too late. But you were more like Isaac or Caterina than me, which is fitting, I suppose. They are both your descendants, while all I was to you was a useless husband who left you with nothing but this land and a baby son to provide for. And from those humble beginnings, you built all this. He raised the wineskin in a toast to the towers before drinking a deep draught. He waited a long moment, wishing with all his heart that Aeneas' ghost would appear and answer him. Or at least berate him, as he knew he deserved. But the only sound he heard was the breeze in the trees, across the river, down below. I can't fault you for taking another husband. Someone to help you and give you more children. He must have been good to you, for you to choose to share your eternal resting place with him instead of me. He could not deny that it hurt, but he deserved the pain. She'd been married to the man for more than 40 years, while he'd only been with Aeneas for 5. He deserved her more than Kempenich ever could. While Aeneas had deserved a good husband the second time around, one question still remained: did Kempenich deserve a second wife? He'd deserted the first so abominably. Did he have any right to happiness with another woman now? Yes, Aeneas had been better off without him, but would Caterina also be better off without him, too? She had her pick of any man in the village, surely, and with Isaac's time at court, he could easily find her a place in the city. Perhaps even with the queen, if she favored bright, capable women as much as Isaac said. She might marry some lord and truly be lady of her own castle, instead of just the chatelaine here. Well, she could be lady of a castle here, or at least one of the castles, even if she was mistress of the whole estate. But that castle came at a price, sharing his bed, a disappointing husband indeed. Oh, he'd do his utmost to please her, but he would eventually fail her, just as he had Aenir. Was it wrong to want that? He wanted to try, at least. If she would only give him the chance to prove himself a capable provider, protector, lover. God, she'd been so soft in his arms that night. Perfection itself. He would do anything to share a bed with her again. Even for only one night. He raised the wineskin to wash down the last of the bread and cheese, only to find it was empty. Cursing, he threw it down on the ground. He could not have drunk all of it, surely. The cook must have given him one that was half empty. Kempenich hoisted himself to his feet. He'd just have to go to the kitchen for another one. But first, he should probably find her father's grave and announce his intentions. Much like Aenir, the man could not reply or offer his blessings, but maybe that was a good thing, for he could not withhold them either, as Caterina's father surely would, if he knew Kempenich was the man responsible for the curse that had plagued the castle for so many centuries. Wishing he'd brought a lantern out with him, he squinted at the stones in the moonlight. If he remembered right, Caterina's father's grave had been on the rise near the churchyard wall, high enough to see over the wall and into the forest beyond. Yes, that was the one. The gravestone was low and curved, unlike some of the others that were as tall and broad as a man. Kempenich cleared his throat. "I've come to ask your blessing, sir." As if all the heavens had conspired to tell him this was a terrible idea, rain began to fall. So much for blessings. Kempenich cursed and lifted his cloak over his head, to shelter him from the pelting droplets as he ran for the castle. Only to almost trip over something on the ground. No, not something. Someone. A woman. Small and soft and wearing a gown that was swiftly becoming soaked in the rain. "Caterina," he breathed. Heedless of his own well-being, he bundled her up in his cloak and bolted for the nearest doorway. It wasn't until the doorway had closed behind him that he realized he'd entered the great hall from a side door. He stood in Aenir's castle, with a wet, shivering, bewildered woman in his arms. His chamber was closer than hers, so he carried her up the stairs so that he might lay her on the bed. Only she was awake now, eyes wide with fear, and when he reached for the lacings of her drenched gown, her eyes widened further still. "What are you doing?" she cried. "Your things are wet. We need to get you out of them and dry so you do not catch a chill," he said. She sat up, her gown clinging to her breasts so that her nipples poked clear through the layers of cloth. "So light the fire then. I'm sure I can manage my own clothes." Yes. Yes, he should do that. Turning his back on her, he dropped to his knees to find a fire already laid, waiting to be lit. Flint and tinder and his shaking hands took far too much time to make a suitable spark, and even longer before it brightened into a proper flame that would not go out. "Caterina." He turned back to her, but the moment he saw her, no words would come out. She'd stripped off her wet garments and now lay beneath the bedclothes, with a sheet pulled up to cover her breasts. Just like that night when she'd invited him into her bed, and they'd nearly. His cock rose to attention, ready for action, even beneath his sodden tunic. Kempenich swallowed. This was not how he was supposed to court a woman he wanted to marry. "Your turn, Sir Kempenich. If you continue to wear such wet things, you will catch a chill and have to spend a week in bed. Heaven knows I do not have time to attend to a sick man. Take those off. At least you have something dry to change into here." She pursed her lips in disapproval. "When you are finished, then you may go to my chamber and bring me some dry things." He was such a fool. He should have taken her to her own bed, not his. What had he been thinking? He hadn't. He'd seen her lying there and he'd panicked, his only thought to protect her and care for her, with no idea of how best to do such a thing. But he'd learn. He'd do exactly as she said, do everything she wanted, until he'd shown her he could be the right man for her. "Yes, my lady," he said, tugging his tunic over his head. He toed off his boots, then shucked off his hose. He scanned the room frantically, looking for a towel or something to dry himself with, but there was nothing. "Use this, Sir Kempenich." Caterina held out a sheet. The same sheet that had covered her naked body only a moment ago. Kempenich fell to his knees at the sight before him. "May all the angels in heaven have mercy." 23. When Caterina awoke in Kempenich's arms, she thought she was dreaming. Only her dreams had never included an autumn downpour, or this kind of drenching. He carried her inside, and the sensible part of her brain told her she should order him to put her down, but she didn't want him to, damn it. And if what Lady Tessa had told her was true, she might be allowed to do more than just dream of him. Of course, after having turned him down once, she'd have to do everything in her power to show him that she'd changed her mind, and that she did desire him. Caterina swallowed. She could run a castle, or even a whole estate, but none of her experience included how to successfully seduce a man. All she'd ever done was order them about, and Kempenich didn't seem like the type of man to take orders. No, he liked to be the one in command. Knights were leaders of men after all, especially battle-hardened ones like him. Hard all over, for she could feel his body through the wet clothes that were all that lay between them. He tossed her on the bed, huge hands reaching for the lacing on her gown. She arched her back up, to give him better access, until she heard something rip. "What are you doing?" she demanded. If he ripped her clothes, she'd have to cross the castle naked after they. Heavens, they were going to do this, weren't they? A thrill darted through her belly, down to her core. Yes. Yes, they were. Kempenich didn't look so sure. One wrong word and he might bolt from the room. "So light the fire then." "I'm sure I can manage my own clothes," she said. She struggled to undo the wet lacings, as all the knots seemed to want to stay tied, until she was ready to rip the gown herself, but she forced herself to be patient. The cord would cooperate eventually and, there it was. Her shift clung to the gown, so she tugged them both off together. It had been too warm for hose today, so she kicked off her boots and socks and slipped beneath Kempenich's sheets. Far finer linen than her own, for only the best linen went on these big beds. A bed big enough for both of them, if she dared. "Your turn, Sir Kempenich," she said eagerly, desperate to see him naked again. To feel his naked body against hers. Heavens, she sounded like the lowest form of strumpet. She certainly felt like it. She blurted out something inane about how he might catch a chill, hoping the blankets hid how she had to clench her thighs together to still the ache between them. Aching for him. Then he bared himself to her, his skin gleaming gold in the firelight, for all the world like some enormous cat. It took her a moment to realize the gleam was only because he was wet all over, and if he didn't dry off soon, he really would catch a chill. Caterina swallowed. There was nothing else for it. She pulled the sheet away from her own naked body, and held it out to him. His eyes devoured her, as he made short work of drying himself off, before he dropped to his knees beside the bed. He uttered what sounded like a prayer, but his eyes never left hers. "My lady, will you allow me to worship you as you deserve?" Her mouth went dry. No one had ever said anything like that to her before, and she didn't know what to reply, so all she could do was nod. It was her breasts he focused on first, caressing them with his hands, then his lips and then his tongue. Then her belly, trailing kisses down to the apex of her thighs, which she still clenched tightly around the memory of his hands caressing her there, until she'd almost Strong hands parted her thighs, and she could not have resisted him, not even if she'd wanted to. Instead, she wanted to offer him everything. "You made me dry off, but you're still wet," he said, sliding a thick, calloused finger inside her. Caterina bucked. God, he felt so good. "That's not the rain," she gasped out. He chuckled. "No, I'm sure you taste far sweeter than anything that falls from heaven." He stuck his wet finger in his mouth and sucked. "Better than I'd imagined. Ever since that night, I've imagined you like this. Naked, just like that night, and I've imagined the sounds you might make when you come for me. Will you moan?" His finger speared into her again, and she couldn't help but clench around him. "Will you cry out my name?" A second finger joined the first, thrusting in and out of her in a maddeningly slow tempo. "Or will you forget everything and just scream?" His thumb pressed against the bundle of nerves she'd touched every night she'd fantasized about him, rubbing harder than he had before. "Come for me, Caterina," he coaxed, sliding a third finger inside her. She gasped. She moaned. She wreathed and bucked and wished with all her being that this time he would not stop. That he would keep going until... "Oh my God, Sir Kempenich! Oh my God!" When her vision cleared, the first thing she saw was him lazily licking his fingers, his eyes almost aglow as he regarded her. "Good girl. Now come for me again." She did, again and again, until she lay panting on the bed, beneath Kempenich's satisfied stare. "Is it too much for you, my lady? Would you have me go to your chamber to fetch you some dry clothes now?" "Stop. Now." Never. Caterina never wanted to leave his bed. "Do you think I am so weak, Sir Kempenich? Nay, you are not too much for me. I am merely catching my breath for a moment, so that I may tell you I want more." There. She truly was a wanton woman, but she would not deny her desires before the man who had the power to satisfy them. To satisfy her. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Her gaze went straight to his manhood, that proud, jutting sword she'd dreamed about but only touched for a moment. She'd wanted him then as she wanted him now, but she wanted more than just this man's body. Lady Tessa's words had allowed her to hope. "I want everything. Everything you have to give," Caterina said. Sir Kempenich frowned. "I am a knight, milady, and I took vows. Most holy vows I dare not break. I cannot give you everything unless you agree to marry me." Caterina closed her eyes. "I do." "What?" He stared at her, wide-eyed, as though he had never seen her before. "I mean to court you, to show you how good a husband I could be in the hope that one day you might." "I do, Sir Kempenich. I will marry you, you will marry me, and we will see how good you are at husbandry. But right now you will give me that." She pointed at his manhood. He stared at her for a moment longer, before a smile lit his face. "Truly, if my lady wishes." He threw himself on the bed beside her, so that his manhood pointed upward instead of at her. "You must take what you want, my lady. If you want all of me, you must take me." When he saw her confusion, he lifted her up and deposited her astride his powerful thighs. He kept one hand beneath her bottom, while he wrapped the other around his manhood, angling it so that it pointed at her. "Take all of me, my lady." She'd heard the maids speak of pain at their first time, but Caterina knew none of it, as she slid down his length, until his glorious cock filled her more deliciously than she'd ever imagined. Then he took hold of her hips and they moved together, until not only was she shouting his name, but he was growling hers. 24. Spring came faster than Caterina expected, though that might have been because her days were spent running the castle with an ever-increasing number of inhabitants, while her nights were a riot of pleasure in Kempenich's bed. The things that man could do with his hands, his manhood and his mouth, it was no wonder her belly was already swelling with his firstborn. The first of many, she suspected, because she could not resist him in the bedchamber. Tessa had insisted on making wedding gowns for them both, in gold silk for herself, and blue silk for Caterina, which fitted her rounded form perfectly. Almost as if she'd known Caterina would be pregnant, well before the wedding. Before the first winter snow had fallen, a small army of apprentices had arrived from the capital, with the Queen's compliments, as well as a man with a limp who introduced himself as Isaac's cousin. "Another Rumpelstiltskin?" Caterina had asked, bewildered, only to be told that Romain was Isaac's cousin on his mother's side, and a Montague from the lowlands to the north, where he and his wife held lands as extensive as those of Burg Rumpelstiltskin, though most of it was salt marsh. Lady Julia, his wife, had brought them a wedding gift of a cartload of the finest sea salt, and instead of sewing or weaving like Tessa, spent most of her days fishing in the river or in deep conversation with Romain and Isaac about the river currents, and how that would affect the design of something they called a water wheel. With so many young men about the place, the chapel was restored before the first snowfall too, so that Isaac began to speak of an early wedding, but Tessa insisted they wait until spring, and no one dared to contradict her. Instead, Isaac had kept the men busy restoring the castle, and putting the golden lion statue in pride of place before the gatehouse, where all who arrived at the castle could once again pat it for luck. Spring arrived with new visitors, a couple Caterina initially took for commoners, for they arrived on foot, until one of the trees beside the road dumped a load of melting snow on the woman. She whirled and waved her hand, summoning a veritable blizzard, which stripped the trees and the road of snow, piling it tidily into a drift that dropped neatly into the river before swirling downstream. A witch with power to rival that of Lady Tessa, who did not seem concerned by her in the least, even before the witch's husband announced that he was Isaac and Romain's uncle, Sir Chase. Rosa, who refused to be addressed by any title aside from her own name, was more interested in Caterina than her niece and nephew. Something about ensuring the fertility and the god's favor for 1,000 years, or so she'd said, eyeing Caterina's belly. Caterina had hazy memories of Rosa and Sir Chase insisting she and Kempenich celebrate midwinter by accompanying them into the forest to some ancient pagan altar, where they drank far more mead than was good for them, and Caterina had woken in her own bed the next morning, her hungover head filled with dreams of Kempenich bending her naked over that ancient altar and pounding into her, until the forest rang with their cries of joy. It must have been a dream, for she would never dream of doing such a thing normally. The priest cleared his throat. "Lady Caterina?" Caterina felt her face grow hot. She'd been so busy thinking about that night, she'd forgotten where she was. "Yes," she squeaked. "Do you agree to wed Sir Kempenich?" "Yes, of course I do," she said, squeezing his hands. Isaac and Tessa had already said their vows, so the ceremony was soon over, and then it was Caterina's responsibility to make sure the wedding feast would be ready to serve to their guests in the great hall later that evening. Tessa stood outside in the churchyard accepting congratulations from Isaac's relatives, so no one heard Kempenich's whisper, "I was this close to bending you over the chapel altar and taking you from behind, just like we did in the woods. Do you think when they're all distracted later, we might be able to sneak out and start our wedding night early?" As though Kempenich had been reading her mind. Caterina turned a beaming smile on her new husband, ready to agree to anything he might suggest, only to find Isaac hurrying up to them. She smoothed her skirts and tried to emulate Tessa's decorum. "The feast will be served in the great hall at sunset, Baron Isaac," she said. He nodded. "Good, and we'll be done by then. Kempenich, would you be willing to help me with something? It won't take long. A family matter that should have been settled a long time ago." Caterina wanted to protest, but before she could say anything, Kempenich patted her on the bottom, promising he wouldn't be long, and headed away with Isaac. She sighed. She really had best check on things in the kitchens. The sooner the feast was over, the sooner she'd be naked with Kempenich. Let Tessa and Isaac amuse their guests while they sneaked away. They were the rulers of the castle after all. For now. She patted her belly. One day, her firstborn would be the master or mistress of Burg Rumpelstiltskin, and down the generations for 1,000 years. 25. This had better be important. I was just about to take my wife off to consummate our marriage, Kempenich complained. Isaac just laughed. You've been consummating your marriage nightly for months, if her swelling belly is anything to go by. I'm sure you can keep it in your hose for an hour or so. This is important, Tessa said. To make sure the curse stays broken. So that the child Caterina was carrying would never know the curse, or any that came after him. I'm listening. Isaac pulled out a pair of gloves. Familiar gloves. Kempenich reached for them, pulling them open to inspect the lining. 4 centuries might have passed, but he would never forget these gloves. Cat fur gloves. The only thing immune to the curse. Given to me by the witch when she cursed my entire bloodline. And passed down through the generations, father to son, so that when the curse came upon us, we could still eat and drink without turning everything we touched to gold, Isaac finished for him. I will be the last to wear them. Tessa said these must be buried in the crypt, before the sun sets on our wedding day. Kempenich swallowed. Or else what? Isaac shrugged. I did not care to ask. If Caterina had told you that you needed to go into the crypt and bury something to ensure the curse never comes back to haunt us, what would you do? I'd be running down those steps without a second thought, Kempenich admitted. To the crypt then. The chapel was empty now, so there was no one to see them open the trapdoor and descend into the depths. Isaac had come prepared with lanterns for them both, so the crypt was so brightly lit, it might have been any corridor in the castle, if not for the rows of stone coffins along the sides. Did Lady Tessa say where we had to bury them? Kempenich asked. Another shrug. No, just that we bury them in here. I suggest we pick one of the coffins and stuff them in there, and close the lid. Buried is buried, and if this was good enough for all the other barons, I'm sure it's good enough for me. But, isn't it bad luck to disturb the graves of the dead? What if their ghosts come back to haunt you, for giving them their gloves back? God knows I would not wish those gloves on anyone. Kempenich shuddered. Fair point. Why don't we put them in your coffin, then? Obviously you don't have a ghost, because you're still here, and if you put them in there, you won't be foisting them on anyone but yourself. Kempenich blew out a breath. Why did it always come back to opening his coffin? No man should have to see his own corpse, but then no man should allow his descendants to endure a curse he should never have asked the witch to cast. This was his burden to bear. Very well. It took both of them to shift the lid, for it was stuck fast, and when they did, it toppled onto the floor, bearing its contents for all to see. Well, if Kempenich had not averted his eyes. He might be willing to put the gloves in his coffin, but that didn't mean he needed to look upon his own remains. By all that's holy, of course. Isaac exclaimed. Help me open the others, Kempenich. I saw my father's death and didn't understand it, but now, it makes so much sense. Other men's bones, even if they were his descendants, were not as objectionable as his own, Kempenich decided, as he helped Isaac push the lid off a coffin, carved with a name he did not recognize. Kempenich gasped. The coffin was filled with gold, coins, cups, daggers, and all manner of small things. Even buttons. He risked a glance over his shoulder at his own coffin, half expecting to see a mouldering corpse, but all he saw was a pile of gold coins, topped by those bloody gloves. They moved along the row of coffins, moving the lids just enough to reveal the glint of gold inside each and every one. I saw my father die, and then his corpse disappeared in a shower of coins. If the curse did this to every baron, it makes sense that their widows put them here in the crypt, in case they ever needed the coin. Robbing and defiling graves in the churchyard would be noticed, but lifting the lid of a coffin in the private family crypt, no one would notice, as long as the lid went back on. Isaac reached into the nearest coffin, and scooped out a handful of coins, letting them run through his fingers back onto the pile. There must be enough gold here to live off for 1,000 years. After suspecting Caterina and her family of stealing it, Kempenich would make it up to her. Tonight, and every other night of their lives together. Every morning too. Can you imagine what the world will be like in 1,000 years? Running water in every home and city. Water wheels and windmills powering machinery. Maybe people of that time will have found a way to fly. Isaac pushed the coffin closed, then moved on to the next one. Seeing how the world has changed in 4 centuries is more than enough for me. I have no wish to live for 1,000 years, or to fly. I wish only to go join my bride, to take this second chance at life I have been given, and fill it with as much happiness as I can. Before someone buries me in here for the second and final time, Kempenich said, shoving the lid closed on his coffin. But what if you could fly? I'd be happy if I could fly, Isaac called after him, slamming the other coffins shut as he went. You're a fool, Isaac. Men can't fly and they never will. I bet Romain and Julia could help me build a flying machine. Something with sails that catches the wind maybe. Or if there is a witch who could power it with magic. We have a wedding feast to attend, Isaac. Or do you want me to tell your bride you wandered off and went flying? That brought Isaac out of the crypt quickly enough. I would never do anything without first consulting Tessa. Do you think she'd like to come flying with me? Kempenich snorted. Lady Tessa is far too intelligent to even consider such a crazy scheme. What crazy scheme? They'd arrived at the Great Hall, and Romain looked as eager as Isaac. Kempenich rolled his eyes. Isaac thinks one day men will fly. Serche shrugged. Rosa can fly. It takes a great deal of magic, but she saved me from a pack of wolves on her flying carpet once. What? Kempenich couldn't believe his ears. Isaac grinned. Oh, I must hear this story, Uncle Chase. Wait until Tessa and Caterina come, for I'm sure they will want to hear it too. A magic carpet, you say? I thought we would need something with sails. Lady Julia looked thoughtful. I suppose with a strong wind, like the ones that blow across the lowlands, and a strong enough sail, one might be able to fly, or at least glide, from a height. What do you think, Romain? Perhaps from the roof of the tower. You're all mad, Kempenich declared. Says the man who was dead for 400 years before he came back as a cat, Tessa retorted as she swept into the room, followed by a servant with a barrel of wine. Kempenich opened his mouth to share some of the secrets of Tessa's past, too, but Caterina entered the hall then, and he had eyes for no one else but his beautiful, glowing wife. He'd do it all again, to know he'd share his future and all the happiness it could hold with her. Maybe not 400 or 1,000 years, but certainly more than any man deserved. And he never had to catch rats or mice for his dinner ever again. Perhaps luck favored him after all. This has been Claim. Puss in Boots Retold. A tale from the Romance, a Medieval Fairy Tale series. Written by Demelza Carlton.